Hey, welcome back. If you're someone who loves history, loves stories about real people who carried impossible weights and somehow kept walking, then I'm really glad you found your way here tonight. Pull your blanket a little closer, get comfortable. Because what I am about to tell you is not the story you learned in school. There is something that keeps me thinking about Elizabeth I. Not the portraits, not the golden gowns, not the speeches, not the armada. Something quieter than all of that. Here is the thing nobody really talks about. Before she was a queen, before she was a legend, before she was Gloriana the Virgin Queen, the symbol of an entire golden age of England, she was just a little girl whose mother was taken from her before she was old enough to ask why. And what happened to that little girl, the one inside the Queen, is a story worth staying up for. Before we go any further, I just want to say, if this kind of storytelling means something to you, if you find yourself settling in and actually feeling history come alive the way it deserves to, it would mean the world to me if you took a second to subscribe and leave a like. Not because a number on a screen matters, but because it tells me that what I am making is reaching the right people. And honestly, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. I always love imagining all the different corners of the world where these stories land. Dim the lights if you can. Let the night do its work, and let us go back. A very long way back. September the 7th, 1533. Greenwich Palace just outside of London. The Thames is silver and quiet in the early autumn light. Inside the palace, the most powerful man in England, possibly in all of Europe, is pacing. Henry VIII has already done the unthinkable. He broke with the Pope. He tore England away from 1,000 years of Catholic tradition. He dissolved his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, a woman who had done nothing wrong except fail to give him a son. He did all of it, because he was absolutely, completely bone-deep certain that Anne Boleyn was going to give him the son he needed, the male heir, the future king, the thing that would make everything worth it. Astrologers had predicted a boy. Physicians had predicted a boy. A birth announcement had already been prepared, a formal document beautifully lettered ready to be sent to the courts of Europe. It read announcing the arrival of a prince, and then the baby arrived, and it was a girl. Henry stood there in the silence of that moment, and somewhere in a great hurry a scribe picked up a quill and added a single letter to that already prepared document. The word prince became princess. That small humiliating addition, that ink-smeared letter S, was the first thing the world ever said about Elizabeth Tudor. She was born a disappointment. She never asked to be. She never had a say. Now I want you to sit with that for just a moment, because I think we sometimes read history as if the people in it are characters in a play, as if Henry VIII was always the tyrant, as if Anne Boleyn was always the tragic queen, as if Elizabeth was always destined to be great. But destiny does not announce itself. It arrives quiet, ordinary, sometimes covered in mud. For the first 2 years of her life, Elizabeth was actually loved. Henry kept his disappointment mostly private, the way powerful men often do, swallowed up in ambition, hoping the next child would be the son he wanted. Anne Boleyn dressed her daughter in tiny versions of royal gowns, took her on walks, wrote letters about her to foreign courts with what reads like genuine maternal pride. Elizabeth had a governess named Lady Margaret Bryan, who wrote to the court that the baby was as toward a child and as gentle of conditions as ever I knew any in my life. She was a bright, gentle, red-haired little thing. She had her father's colouring, and it would turn out her father's iron will. But she had no idea yet what was coming. None of us ever do. Then May of 1536 arrived. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. She would not have understood the sound of it, the cheering or the wailing in the streets, the doors closing, the way the servants moved differently, spoke differently, looked at her differently. She would not have understood the word treason. She would not have understood what an executioner does. All she knew, in the simple, devastating way that small children know things before they have words for them, was that her mother was there, and then her mother was not. Gone. Just gone. Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536. Convicted on charges of adultery and treason that most historians today believe were engineered by her enemies at court to clear the way for Henry to move on to his next wife. And Henry did move on with a speed that still feels shocking even 500 years later. He was engaged to Jane Seymour the very next day. Within 11 days he was married. Within weeks Parliament passed an act declaring Henry's marriage to Anne invalid, not just ended but retroactively erased, which meant Elizabeth was no longer a princess. She was no longer legitimate. She was, in the language of the law, nobody's real daughter. She was the Lady Elizabeth. A title that sounds polite on the surface and means almost nothing underneath. Here is what I find so quietly devastating about this. A little girl lost her mother. That is already a grief most of us can barely imagine. But then on top of that grief, the world told her that the mother she lost had never really been her mother. Not legally. Not officially. Not in any way that counted. Anne Boleyn's name could not even be spoken aloud at court without risking her father's explosive rage. So Elizabeth grew up in a silence about her own origins, a silence that must have felt at some level like her own existence was a mistake the world was not sure what to do with. Historian Larissa Taylor-Smither wrote that by analysing the overlapping traumas of Elizabeth's early life, we arrive at a completely different understanding of the woman she became, and I think that is exactly right. Because what Elizabeth learned in those early years, before she could even read, before she had any real power, was a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. The world can take everything from you, without warning, without explanation, and the only thing that might save you is your own silence, your own stillness, your own ability to become exactly what the moment requires. After Anne's execution, Elizabeth was moved to Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, a royal manor comfortable enough staffed with servants, but far from court, out of sight. Her staff was reduced. Her clothes became a source of diplomatic hand-wringing. Letters survived from her governess to the court asking with a kind of tired frustration whether someone could please send the child new dresses because she had grown out of everything and had nothing suitable to wear. Meanwhile, in London, her father was celebrating the birth of a son, Edward, born to Jane Seymour in October of 1537. The kingdom rejoiced. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and somewhere at Hatfield a 4-year-old girl in clothes that were slightly too small for her was quietly, without knowing it, becoming an afterthought. But here is what Henry underestimated. Maybe what everyone underestimated. Isolation is one kind of education, and young Elizabeth was learning it deeply. By the time she was 6 or 7 years old, she had been restored somewhat to royal favour. Henry's 6th wife, Catherine Parr, had a genuinely kind heart, and brought all 3 of Henry's children together under one roof, insisting on it. It was Catherine Parr who convinced Henry to include Elizabeth in the line of succession again in 1544. A lifeline Elizabeth accepted without fanfare, without showing how much it meant, because she had already learned not to show too much. Tutors were appointed for her education, and this is where something extraordinary began to happen. Elizabeth turned out to be by any measure a prodigy. By the age of 12, she was reading and writing in Latin, French, Italian, Spanish, and Greek. Her tutor Roger Ascham, one of the greatest scholars in England, wrote of her with something close to awe. He said she had a mind so quick, so precise, so naturally inclined toward both languages and reasoning, that in his years of teaching he had rarely encountered anything like it. She translated works of theology and philosophy as a child the way other children did needlework. She wrote letters in multiple languages before she was a teenager. At 13, she completed a translation of a French religious poem as a New Year's gift for her stepmother, Catherine Parr, and the handwriting was perfect, the prose, elegant, the scholarship sound. Now, I want to pause here for a second, because this is the part that tends to get brushed past the way extraordinary things often get brushed past when they happen to girls. People look at the portrait of Elizabeth at age 13, a serious red-haired, pale-faced young woman in a dark gown holding a book, and they think, well, yes, she was educated. Royals were educated. But that is not quite it. The education Elizabeth received was unusual even by the standards of royal boys, let alone royal girls. She was being trained in logic, rhetoric, classical languages, theology, history. Not because anyone expected her to use it, but because her stepmother Catherine believed in it, and because Elizabeth herself wanted it, with a hunger that nobody seems to have been able to explain except perhaps this. When you have lost your mother, your title, your legitimacy, your place, the one thing no one can take from you is what you put inside your own mind. Henry VIII died on January the 28th, 1547. Elizabeth was 13 years old. She was at Enfield when she was told. Contemporary accounts say she and her half-brother Edward, who had just learned he was now king, held each other and wept together. And then it was over. The private grief had to be folded away. There were things to do. There always were. The years between Henry's death and Elizabeth's accession to the throne, roughly 11 years, are a story we will come back to in pieces. There are too many rooms in that story to open all at once. The dangerous situation with Thomas Seymour, the years under her sister Mary's suspicious, frightened reign, the months inside the Tower of London, all of it is coming. But I want to end this first part by sitting with something simpler, because I think sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones we try to skip over in our hurry to get to the famous parts. On September the 7th, 1533, a baby was born at Greenwich Palace. A document was prepared celebrating a prince. A single letter was added in haste. A girl arrived into a world that had not wanted her. Her mother would be dead before she was 3. Her name would be erased from the official record. Her title would be stripped. Her legitimacy would be questioned by half of Europe for the rest of her life. And this girl, this nobody, this inconvenience, this afterthought with the corrected birth announcement, would go on to reign for 45 years. She would outlast every single person who ever doubted her. She would outlast the men who tried to use her, the men who tried to marry her off the men who tried to execute her, the men who prayed for her death. She would give her name to an entire age of history, and she would do it while carrying every single one of those early wounds inside her, quietly, because that is what she had learned to do. Now I told you Elizabeth's story begins with a little girl nobody expected. But the next chapter, the one about what happens when that little girl grows up inside a court full of danger, surrounded by people who see her as either a threat or a tool, that is where things get very interesting. Because the years that followed Henry's death brought Elizabeth face to face with something she had never encountered before. Not grief, not loneliness, something more complicated. A man who wanted something from her, and a girl who was not sure for the first time in her life what she herself wanted back. The story of Thomas Seymour the Tower, and the education Elizabeth received in silence and survival, that is where we are going next. Stay with me. So we left Elizabeth at a turning point, a girl who had already lost more than most adults ever lose, her mother, her title, her legitimacy, her place, and yet somehow she kept going, kept learning, kept growing, kept becoming. But the world, as it tends to do, was not finished testing her, not by a long stretch. January the 28th, 1547, Henry VIII is dead, and within weeks, almost immediately, the vultures begin to circle. Now I want to introduce you to someone. His name is Thomas Seymour, and if there is one person in this entire story who makes my skin crawl more than almost anyone else, it is this man. Thomas Seymour was by all accounts extraordinarily handsome, charming in the way that certain men are charming, the kind where you feel the warmth of it before you notice the calculation behind it. He was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, which made him uncle to the new boy King Edward VI. That connection gave him power, and power in Tudor England was currency. But Thomas Seymour wanted more. He always wanted more. He was the kind of man who looked at the world and saw only what he did not yet have. Within months of Henry's death, Seymour secretly married Catherine Parr. Catherine was Henry's widow, a gentle, brilliant, deeply kind woman who had genuinely loved Elizabeth as a daughter. She had fought for Elizabeth's education. She had fought for Elizabeth's place in the succession. In a court full of people who saw the young princess as a complication, Catherine Parr had seen her as a person. So when Elizabeth came to live in their household at Chelsea Manor that year, she must have felt, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, something close to safe. She was 13 years old. Thomas Seymour was nearly 40, and he had been eyeing her since before her father was even cold. Here is where the history gets uncomfortable, and I think it is important not to look away from it. Because what happened in that household has shaped how historians understand Elizabeth's entire adult life. Seymour began visiting Elizabeth's bedchamber in the early mornings, before she was up, before her ladies were properly awake. He would come in his nightgown, slapping her on the back, or on the back of her legs, laughing about it, tickling her, making a game of it. Her governess Cat Ashley, a woman who essentially raised Elizabeth and loved her like a mother, described these incidents in detail when she was later interrogated by the authorities. The record says he would come in many mornings, would bid her good morrow, and if she rose early to avoid him, he would pull back her bed curtains and make as if to come in anyway. Elizabeth, 13 and 14 years old, began waking before dawn to be dressed and surrounded by her ladies before he arrived, because that was the only defence available to her. Think about that for a second. A teenage girl in the household that was supposed to protect her engineering, her own mornings around a grown man's behaviour, not crying to anyone, not making a scene, just quietly, methodically working out how to stay safe within the rules she'd been given. That is not the instinct of a frightened child. That is the beginning of a survival intelligence that would define the next 50 years of her life. Catherine Parr, for her part, initially dismissed what was happening. Some historians argue she convinced herself it was harmless horseplay, that Seymour was simply being playful. Others suggest she knew exactly what it was and was too frightened of losing him to confront it directly. Whatever her reasoning, and I think about her with a great deal of sadness, what happened next is genuinely hard to read. On one occasion in the garden, records show that Catherine Parr held Elizabeth still, while Seymour took a dagger and slashed her black morning gown to ribbons. Together, her stepmother, her protector, the woman who had fought to have her included in the line of succession, holding her down while her husband's blade cut through her clothes. Now, I am not going to stand here and condemn Catherine Parr entirely, because the 16th century was not the 21st century, and because Catherine herself was operating inside a world where she had almost no real power over her own husband. But I do think it tells us something essential about what Elizabeth learned in those years, about who could be trusted, about what protection actually looked like, about the difference between someone who loved you and someone who merely meant well. The situation finally broke in the spring of 1548. Catherine, who was pregnant with what would be her first child, discovered Seymour with his arms around Elizabeth. She did not rage. She did not publicly accuse. She simply sent Elizabeth away. Quietly, firmly, permanently. Elizabeth went to the household of Sir Anthony Denny at Cheshunt, and she wrote to Catherine from there a letter that historians have puzzled over for centuries. It was a letter full of warmth and affection, full of what reads like genuine sorrow at the separation. But it was also a very careful letter, a letter that never named what had happened, a letter that managed to say a great deal without saying anything that could be used against anyone. At 14 years old, Elizabeth was already a diplomat. Catherine Parr died on the 5th of September 1548, 6 days after giving birth to a baby girl. She was 36 years old, and in her dying hours, delirious with fever, she apparently said that those she trusted had not dealt well with her. Some believe she was speaking of Seymour. Some believe she was speaking of something else entirely. We will never know for certain. But I think about Catherine Parr dying in that castle in Gloucestershire, 36 years old, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and genuine goodness, and I feel the weight of it. She deserved better than she got. Most women in this story did. Thomas Seymour, freed from the complication of his wife's existence, moved faster than anyone expected. He began making overtures about marrying Elizabeth. Not quiet ones, not subtle ones. He was not a subtle man. Elizabeth's cofferer, Thomas Parry, was later questioned about conversations he had had with her on this very subject, whether the council would agree, whether Elizabeth herself might be willing. And this is where Elizabeth's response becomes remarkable, because she was 15 years old. She had just lost the closest thing she had to a mother. She was living in someone else's house, technically illegitimate, technically without a home of her own. And a handsome, powerful, charming man who'd been paying her very particular attention for 2 years was now suggesting they might get married. Her answer recorded in the historical record was she would consider such a thing only if the council consented and the king commanded. Not yes, not no, a wall made of protocol. Behind it, nothing anyone could touch. Seymour was arrested in January of 1549 on charges of treason. The charges were many and varied. He had been scheming against his brother, attempting to control the young king, conducting illegal dealings with pirates on the western coast. But the question of Elizabeth hovered over the whole investigation. Had she known? Had she agreed? Were there letters? Were there promises? 2 of her closest attendants, Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry, were arrested and taken to the Tower of London for questioning, and a government interrogator named Sir Robert Tyrwhitt arrived at Elizabeth's door. He told her in so many words that her people had confessed, that the game was up, that she might as well tell him everything. He was lying. But it was a very convincing lie. Elizabeth was 15 years old, alone, her governess gone, her friends gone, and she looked at this man, this official representative of the government that controlled whether she lived or died, and she did not crack. Tyrwhitt, who was no fool, later wrote in frustration that she sang the same song as Parry and Ashley, that he could not get a single word out of her that contradicted anything they had said, that she cried, genuinely cried, but would give him nothing that could be used. She was 15. She outmaneuvered a trained government interrogator at 15. Seymour was executed on the 20th of March 1549 on Tower Hill, the same hill where other men had died, where other enemies of the crown had been made examples of. Elizabeth, when told, reportedly said only, "This day died a man of much wit and very little judgment." 7 words. No grief visible, no relief visible. Just 7 words that said everything and gave away nothing. She was 15 years old. I genuinely do not know whether to be impressed or heartbroken. Maybe both. Now the years that followed were in their own way more dangerous than anything that came before, because at least when Seymour was scheming, the danger had a face. What came next was shapeless and ambient and constant, Her half-brother Edward VI was dying. Everyone could see it, though no one said it openly. The young king, brilliant and earnest and only 16 years old, was consumed by illness, most likely tuberculosis, and as his body failed him, the political world around him began its frantic calculations. And then Edward died in July of 1553, aged 15. What followed was 9 days of extraordinary confusion. A woman named Lady Jane Grey on the throne who had never asked to be, and then the inevitable arrival of Mary I, Henry's oldest surviving child, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, a Catholic who had spent her entire adult life watching Protestants dismantle everything she believed in. Mary had been through her own particular kind of hell. She had watched her mother be set aside, her parents' marriage, destroyed her own legitimacy, stripped her faith, treated as treasonous, and now she was queen. And her half-sister Elizabeth Protestant, Elizabeth Anne Boleyn's daughter, the girl whose very existence was a walking reminder of everything Mary had lost, was next in line to the throne. Can I ask you something? If you try to put yourself in Mary's position, genuinely, honestly, setting aside what you already know about history, what would you do? Here is this woman who represents a direct threat to everything you have built, who is younger than you, more popular than you, backed by every Protestant in the country. What do you do? Mary, to her credit, did not immediately execute her sister. That matters. There were advisers around her, particularly the Spanish ambassador Simon Renard, who argued from the very beginning that the throne would never be safe as long as Elizabeth was alive. Mary resisted, for a while. But then came January of 1554, and a man named Thomas Wyatt. Wyatt led a rebellion, not the first, not the last, but the one that changed everything, ostensibly in protest against Mary's planned marriage to Philip II of Spain, a Spanish king consort, for an English queen. The combination offended a significant portion of the country deeply, and Wyatt mobilized that offence into actual armed opposition. He wrote to Elizabeth. The letter was intercepted. Its contents implied, not confirmed, that Elizabeth had some knowledge of what was being planned. That was enough. Mary's council decided that Elizabeth must be brought to London, questioned, and if necessary removed. March the 16th, 1554. 2 of Mary's councillors arrived at Elizabeth's residence at Ashridge. She had been ill, genuinely physically ill, the kind of full-body illness that often accompanied her periods of extreme stress. She was brought to Whitehall by litter too weak to ride. She asked to see her sister. Mary refused. She asked to be allowed to write to Mary. She was given permission. And she wrote what historian David Starkey has called, without exaggeration, the most important letter of her life. The letter itself, historians call it the Tide Letter, because as Elizabeth wrote it, the tide turned on the Thames, making it impossible for her guards to take her to the Tower that day, is a masterpiece of controlled desperation. She wrote to Mary as a loyal subject. She wrote as a sister. She asked only to be allowed to speak to the Queen in person before being imprisoned. She drew a long line of blank space at the bottom of the last page, deliberately, historians believe, so that no one could add anything to it after she had finished. She was buying time. 1 day, maybe 2. And she was making absolutely certain that nothing she had written could be twisted into evidence against her. The tide turned, but the tide came back in. On the 17th of March, 1554, Elizabeth was taken by boat down the Thames to the Tower of London. It was Palm Sunday. It was raining. The boat arrived at the Traitors' Gate, the water entrance through which prisoners passed beneath the outer wall of the tower, directly onto the stone steps that led into the complex. The same gate through which her mother had passed 18 years before. Elizabeth refused to get off the boat. She sat there in the rain on the cold stone steps between the water and the gate, and she would not. One of the lords with her, the Earl of Sussex, by some accounts, reportedly knelt in the rain and begged her to come inside. She's said to have looked at him and said she was no traitor. Then she stood up, walked inside, and the gate closed behind her. The Tower of London in 1554 was not simply a prison. It was a place where your family went to die. Elizabeth's mother had been beheaded there. Her cousin Lady Jane Grey would be executed within its walls just weeks after Elizabeth arrived. Elizabeth's rooms were in the palace complex of the inner ward, comfortable enough by the standards of imprisonment, with a small staff of attendants. But she could hear things. She could hear the bells of the city. She could hear guards. She could hear at a certain hour of certain mornings the particular sounds that meant someone was being prepared for execution. We know from the historical record that she spent roughly 2 months inside those walls. We know she was interrogated on Good Friday by a council that desperately wanted her to say something, anything that could justify a trial. We know she asked repeatedly to speak to the Queen. Mary refused every single time. There is a small detail from this period that I've never been able to shake. During her imprisonment, Elizabeth apparently spent time walking in a small garden within the Tower complex. She was allowed this much a little outdoor exercise watched carefully by guards. And on one occasion, according to contemporary accounts, the young son of a Tower warder, a small boy maybe 4 or 5 years old, arrived at the garden gate with a bunch of flowers and handed them to her. He came back several times after that. The boy had apparently decided, with the pure, uncomplicated instinct of small children, that the lady in the garden was sad and needed flowers. His father, horrified, eventually told him to stop. Elizabeth, it is said, wept. I wonder sometimes what it means that the only person who simply straightforwardly tried to comfort her was a child too young to understand the politics of it. On the 19th of May, 1554, Elizabeth was released. On that same date, 18 years earlier, her mother had been executed. Whether Mary chose that date deliberately as a kind of dark reminder, or whether it was coincidence, historians disagree. Elizabeth was not freed. She was transferred to house arrest at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, under the watchful and rather grim supervision of a man named Sir Henry Bedingfield. As her procession moved through the towns between London and Woodstock, people lined the roads, cheering, bringing gifts, cakes and flowers and little tokens pressed through hands. Elizabeth, who had come out of the Tower pale and thin and still careful in everything she said, must have registered this with a part of her mind that was already calculating what it meant. The people wanted her. Whether or not the council did, whether or not her sister did, the people. The months at Woodstock are in some ways the quietest part of Elizabeth's life before she became queen. She had books, she had a small number of attendants, she walked in the grounds, she waited. And at some point during that waiting, at some point in those long, careful, watchful days, she scratched something into a window pane at Woodstock with a diamond. The words are recorded in the historical accounts. She wrote, "Much suspected by me. Nothing proved can be. That is not the writing of a frightened girl. That is the writing of a woman who has understood something fundamental about how the world works. Evidence matters. What can be proven matters. And if you leave them nothing to prove, if you give them no weapon to use against you, they cannot touch you." Mary I died on the 17th of November 1558. She was 42 years old. She had been queen for 5 years. She had burned nearly 300 people at the stake for the crime of Protestant belief, earning her the nickname history has given her. She had married Philip of Spain and watched the marriage become a hollow, painful thing. Philip rarely in England, no heir. The country bled dry by a war fought for Spanish interests. She died without a child. She died, by some accounts, believing that she had failed everything she had tried to build. Elizabeth was at Hatfield House when the messenger arrived. the same Hatfield house where she had grown up, where she'd been sent, when her legitimacy was stripped, where she had learned Latin and French and Greek, while waiting for a future that might or might not arrive. She was 25 years old. She was sitting under an oak tree reading when the lords rode up, and they knelt, and she became queen. The story that has come down to us says that she spoke in Latin in that moment. She said, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes." A line from the Psalms. Careful even now. Even in the moment of her greatest triumph, she gave them scripture instead of herself. But I think, and this is my own reading, not a historical fact, so take it for what it is worth, I think underneath the Latin, underneath the composed piety of that moment, there was something rawer than anyone was allowed to see. This girl, this inconvenient girl, the one nobody had wanted, the one they had tried to erase, to strip, to imprison, to break. She was queen. All of them were wrong. Every single one of them. And here is the thing I keep coming back to. The Elizabeth who walked into that first Privy Council meeting in November of 1558 was not simply a young woman who had been lucky enough to survive. She was someone who had been educated by very specific experiences. She knew what it felt like to be absolutely dependent on another person's decision about whether you lived or died. She knew what it felt like to be questioned by an interrogator who was trying to trap her. She knew what it felt like to sit in a prison that had swallowed her mother. She knew what it felt like to have power stripped away without warning, and she knew what it felt like to watch it come back. All of that knowing, all of it went with her into that council chamber, and it stayed with her for the next 45 years. So now she is queen, 25 years old, brilliant, guarded, complicated, and the entire court, the entire country, half of Europe, they all had exactly one question. When is she going to get married? Because surely a woman cannot rule alone. Surely she needs a king beside her. Surely she will choose someone and settle down and do what women are supposed to do. That assumption, so confident, so loud, so universal, was about to run headlong into the most interesting, most layered, most quietly devastating love story in all of English history. A story involving a man she had known since she was 8 years old. A man she may have loved her entire life. A man whose name, Sweet Robin, she whispered even in old age, and a man she could never ever allow herself to have. That story is coming next. Right. She is queen now. 25 years old, standing at Hatfield House under an oak tree, and for the first time in her life no one is waiting to take her somewhere against her will. No interrogators, no sisters with suspicious counsellors at her door, no guards. For the first time in her entire existence, Elizabeth Tudor is the most powerful person in the room. Every room, all of England, and the first thing the men around her want to talk about, the very first order of business before the ink on her accession is even dry, is who she's going to marry. I want to pause here and just appreciate how deeply, almost impressively, the men of 1558 misread the situation. Here is a woman who has survived the execution of her mother, the stripping of her title, the death of the only father figure she knew, a predatory stepfather, a government interrogation at 2 months in the Tower, and nearly a year under house arrest. And the English Parliament's first official thought was essentially great. Now let's find her a husband as things can get back to normal. She had been queen for less than 10 weeks, when Parliament formally sent a delegation to request that she marry. Her response, delivered coolly through an intermediary in the measured language of a woman who has had a lot of practice not saying what she actually means, was something close to remarkable. She told them she had chosen this kind of life from her earliest understanding, that she was already bound to a husband, the Kingdom of England, and if her life ended without a marriage, she said, then let a marble stone declare that a queen had lived and died a virgin. The delegation went home. Parliament was not satisfied, and the conversation that would consume the next 45 years of her reign had officially begun. But here is the thing nobody in Parliament knew, or perhaps chose to see. There was already someone. There had been someone for a very long time. His name was Robert Dudley. And the story of Elizabeth and Robert Dudley is not the grand romantic legend that novelists and filmmakers have made of it. It is something stranger, something quieter, something that I think says more about who Elizabeth truly was than almost anything else in her entire life. They had known each other since they were children. Robert himself told a French diplomat in 1566 that he and the Queen had been friends before she was 8 years old. He was a year older than her, the son of a powerful courtier named John Dudley, and they moved in the same circles, in the same palaces, in the same political world that had shaped them both. By the time Elizabeth became queen, they had known each other for nearly 20 years. They had both been prisoners in the Tower of London at the same time. In the same complex in early 1554, she suspected of treason he under a suspended death sentence for his part in the failed plot to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. His father had been executed. His brother Guildford had been executed. He had lived in that building knowing that his own head might follow. And she had been in that same building a few hundred yards away carrying her own version of exactly the same fear. There is a kind of bond that forms between people who have looked at the same ceiling and wondered the same thing about their own mortality. It does not need to be explained. It does not need to be performed. It simply exists. On the day Elizabeth became queen, that same November day at Hatfield, Robert Dudley was there almost immediately. One of her first official appointments was to make him Master of the Horse. This was not a minor gesture. Master of the Horse was among the most intimate positions at the royal court. It meant he rode directly behind her in every procession. It meant he was responsible for organising every journey she took, every hunt, every outdoor occasion. It meant he had daily physical unavoidable access to the Queen. She knew exactly what she was doing, and within weeks so did everyone else. Now here is where the history gets genuinely complicated, and I want to try to do justice to it because I think the popular version of this story gets something fundamentally wrong. The popular version says Elizabeth loved Robert, Robert loved Elizabeth, but he was married, and then his wife died suspiciously, and so Elizabeth could never marry him because of the scandal. End of story. But that is not quite the shape of what actually happened, because by the time Amy Robsart died in September of 1560, Elizabeth had already been queen for nearly 2 years, and in those 2 years the Spanish ambassador had been writing home with increasing alarm about how much time Elizabeth spent with Dudley. He wrote to King Philip that Lord Robert had come so much into favour that he did whatever he liked with affairs, and that Elizabeth visited him in his chambers day and night. He wrote that Dudley's wife had a malady in one of her breasts, probably cancer, and that the Queen was only waiting for her to die to marry Lord Robert. These were not secret whispers. This was the talk of every court in Europe, which tells you something important. Even before Amy's death, Elizabeth was already deep in whatever this was with Robert, and she knew the whole world was watching. She always knew the whole world was watching. On the 8th of September 1560, a Sunday, Amy Robsart sent all her household servants to a fair in the nearby town of Abingdon. Every single servant. She was insistent about it. Even when some of them seemed reluctant to go, she pressed them. When they returned that evening to Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire, they found her dead at the bottom of a short flight of stairs. Her neck was broken. There were 2 small wounds on the back of her head. She was 28 years old. Robert was at Windsor with the Queen when the news arrived. A messenger named Bowes rode to him and delivered a letter. Robert's own words survive from that moment. He wrote to his cousin Thomas Blount almost immediately, and the letter reads like a man genuinely in shock. He asked Blount to go to Cumnor. He asked him to investigate thoroughly. He wanted the truth, he said. Whatever the truth was. That letter has been read two ways for 500 years, as evidence of genuine devastation and innocent confusion, or as the performance of a guilty man covering himself. Historians still argue about it. The coroner's jury delivered a verdict of accidental death, what the legal language of the time called misfortune, the following year. Modern historians and medical researchers have suggested that Amy may have had breast cancer that had spread to her spine, which could have caused a spontaneous fracture and a fatal fall down even a small set of stairs. That theory would explain a great deal. It would also explain why she sent the servants away. Perhaps she wanted to be alone with whatever pain she was in. Perhaps she simply fell. But here is the brutal irony of the whole thing. The death that should have freed Robert Dudley to marry the Queen he loved. The death that cleared the only practical obstacle between them was the very event that made marrying him impossible. Because now everyone assumed one of two things. Either he had arranged it, or she had, or both, and marrying a man surrounded by that kind of suspicion was not something Elizabeth could survive politically. She told the French ambassador with characteristic bluntness she could not do without her Lord Robert, for he was like her little dog. She called him her eyes. She called him Bonny Sweet Robin. She gave him Kenilworth Castle and lands and titles and extraordinary access. But she would not marry him. She could not marry him. And I wonder sometimes whether on some level she might not have even admitted to herself she understood that marrying him would change everything between them in ways she was not willing to risk. There is something I want to say here, and it is something I have thought about for a long time. We tend to look at Elizabeth's refusal to marry Dudley as either a political calculation or a romantic tragedy, depending on which kind of story we prefer. But what if it was something more complicated than either? What if part of what Elizabeth understood from her very particular experience of men and power and loss was that the moment she made Robert her husband, she made him her superior. By the law and custom of the 16th century, a husband was the head of the household, even if the household was a kingdom, even if the wife was a queen. She had watched what happened to her half-sister Mary, who married Philip of Spain. The marriage treaty had explicitly given Philip no authority in England, and yet his influence had been enormous. England had gone to war for Spanish interests. England had bled for his ambitions, all because the law, the culture, the ingrained assumption of an entire civilization said that a husband led and a wife followed. Elizabeth had no intention of following anyone. She had spent too much of her life at other people's mercy to voluntarily hand her power to a man she loved. Because loving someone, as she had learned very early, does not prevent them from hurting you. So instead they built something else. Something that had no name in 1558 because it had never existed before. Robert was not her husband. He was not quite her minister. He was not a simple favourite in the way that word implies flattery and access and nothing more. He was in some ways that matter more than the formal ones her partner. He managed her household. He managed her entertainments. He was often her first call after a difficult council, meeting her companion in the evenings, the person to whom she complained about the very pressures of being queen that she would never have admitted in public. He organised extraordinary spectacles for her at Kenilworth Castle. 5 visits over the course of their relationship, the most famous in 1575, when she stayed for 19 days. And the celebrations were so elaborate that the fireworks could be heard 20 miles away. 19 days. Not a state visit, not an obligation. She simply did not want to leave. And yet, and here is where the sadness of the story lives, I think, For all of that, all those years, all those letters, all those 19-day stays and private evenings and whispered nicknames, Robert was still a man. And men in the 16th century needed things that a queen, for political reasons, could not give them. They needed heirs. They needed a marriage. They needed a life that extended beyond the orbit of a woman who could never fully commit to them without threatening everything she had built. By the early 1570s, Robert had been at Elizabeth's side for more than a decade. He had waited. He had hoped. He had turned down the prospect of marrying Mary Queen of Scots at Elizabeth's request, even though it might have secured his own future. And at some point in those years he began to understand that Elizabeth was never going to choose him, not the way he needed to be chosen. By 1578 he had been a widower for 18 years. He married again, secretly. In September of that year, in a quiet private ceremony at Wanstead House, Robert Dudley married Lettice Knollys, Elizabeth's own first cousin, a red-haired woman by many accounts almost disconcertingly beautiful. He told nobody. For months nobody breathed a word to the Queen, and then the French envoy, a man named Simier, who was in London to negotiate a marriage between Elizabeth and the Duke of Anjou, a marriage Robert had been quietly trying to sabotage, decided that the best way to advance his master's cause was to remove Robert from the picture entirely. He told Elizabeth. Her reaction, by the accounts of everyone who witnessed it, was incandescent. She banned Lettice from court, not just for a season, not as a statement, permanently. For the rest of Elizabeth's life, Lettice Knollys was never permitted to appear in the Queen's presence, not once, not even decades later, but Robert himself. After a period of what contemporaries described as coldness between them, they resumed. Their relationship continued remarkably almost as before, because the thing about a bond that is forged in childhood and tested in a prison tower and shaped by 40 years of shared existence, it does not simply end because one person did something the other person cannot forgive. It just changes. It becomes something quieter, something that lives in the space between what was said and what was meant. Robert wrote to her from the Netherlands in 1585, where he was commanding an English military expedition she had reluctantly agreed to send. He wrote regularly. He called himself her creature. He apologized for being away. He worried about her health. He reminded her in the measured language of formal letters that she was always in his thoughts. And she wrote back. Her letters to him were mostly destroyed after a death, perhaps by those who understood what they contained. But one thing survived. A small bundle of his letters to her, tied together and kept in a box beside her bed. Historians call it the bedside casket. She kept it there until the end of her life, when Robert Dudley died on the 4th of September 1588. Just weeks after the Spanish Armada had been defeated, the greatest victory of Elizabeth's reign. He was 55 years old. He had been ill. He was travelling north to Kenilworth to recover in the place she had visited so many times. He wrote to her from the road a short letter, asking after her health, mentioning a remedy he had sent her. He called it, "Your most humble and faithful letter." He died 4 days later. Elizabeth shut herself in her chambers. She refused to see anyone for days. The Privy Council became alarmed enough that they eventually had the doors forced open. She emerged eventually. She went back to being queen. She had no other option. But she kept that last letter. She wrote on it in her own hand 2 words, his last letter. She kept it beside her bed for the next 15 years, for the rest of her life. Here is what I think, having sat with this story for a long time. I think Robert Dudley was genuinely the love of Elizabeth's life, not in the way romance novels describe love, not the breathless, consuming, abandon-everything kind, but in the harder, quieter, more enduring way. The kind where someone knows you before you became who the world expects you to be, the kind where the friendship came first, and the feeling grew inside it like something that did not need to announce itself. The kind where you know for absolute certain that this particular person sees you not the crown, not the symbol, not the legend you. And yet, she chose the crown. Over and over and over again across 40 years she chose the crown. Because she understood something that I think is genuinely profound even now, that she was not just a woman, she was a country, and a country cannot afford to love one person the way a person can. Now the question everyone around her asked Parliament, her council, her advisers, foreign kings, the Pope, was why she would not marry anyone at all, not just Robert, anyone. There were other suitors, many other suitors. Philip of Spain proposed. Archduke Charles of Austria was seriously considered. The Duke of Anjou, the French match, came the closest of any of them to actually happening. Elizabeth was in her 40s by then. She wore a small ring Anjou had given her on her finger. She wept when the match eventually collapsed under the weight of public opposition. But she did not pursue it. She never pursued it. And the real reason, beyond the politics and the scandal and the strategic calculus, was something she had understood since she was a girl. Since she was 2 years old and her mother disappeared. Since she was 14 and someone she trusted invaded her room. Since she was 15 and sat alone in a house while the government tried to take everything from her. She'd learned in the most specific and personal way possible what it meant to need someone, what it meant to be at the mercy of someone else's choices about your life. And she had decided somewhere in the depth of herself that she would not be in that position again. Not for love, not for an heir, not for a parliament that could not understand why she kept saying no. She would be needed, she would never need. That decision, that quiet, iron, lifelong refusal, cost her something. We can feel it in the letters she kept in the casket. We can feel it in the 25 years she refused to allow Robert's wife to enter a room she was standing in. We can feel it in the way in her final years she sometimes sat for long stretches of silence that her ladies did not understand. The price of that refusal was real, and she paid it every single day for 45 years and never once let anyone see her pay it. Except maybe in the letters she kept and did not burn. But there is another layer to the public version of Elizabeth that we have never really talked about. The one about her body, the face she chose to show the world, the face that was not her face. Because while her heart was quietly enduring what no one was allowed to see, the rest of England and Elizabeth herself was about to discover that being a queen means your body is not your own either. And in 1562 something happened that would change Elizabeth's relationship with her own reflection for the rest of her life. That story is coming, and it is more raw and more human than most history books are willing to admit. October the 10th, 1562. Hampton Court Palace. The Thames outside the windows, the gardens yellow with autumn, the court bustling with the ordinary business of a Monday morning. Elizabeth was 29 years old, 4 years into her reign, and she was not feeling well. That was nothing unusual in a way. She had always been prone to illness. Her childhood had been punctuated by fevers and fatigue, the physical language of a body under relentless pressure. So when she began to feel unwell that morning, she did what most of us do with something that feels like a bad cold. She took a hot bath. She went outside for some air. She told herself she would feel better soon. She would not feel better soon. Within days, the fever had climbed to something frightening. By the 16th of October, 6 days after she first felt ill, Elizabeth Tudor was unable to speak. She lay in her bed at Hampton Court unconscious, the Privy Council gathering outside in hushed, urgent groups. William Cecil had been called to the palace at midnight. The Spanish ambassador had already written to Philip of Spain informing him that the Queen of England appeared to be dying, and here was the problem that terrified everyone in equal measure. England had no heir. Elizabeth had no husband, no children, no named successor. If she died that October in that room from that fever, no one knew with any certainty what would happen next. Civil war was not a remote possibility. It was the most likely outcome. So they called for the German physician. His name was Burchard Cranich, known at court as Dr. Burko, and he had already made one visit and apparently dismissed the Queen's symptoms as insufficiently serious, which by the accounts of those present had made Elizabeth furious. Legend has it she called him a fool. She may well have been right. When Burkote was brought back urgently and told to do anything, he used a treatment that had existed in various forms across Europe since the 12th century. He wrapped Elizabeth from her neck to her feet in red cloth, completely. Bursts of red flannel around her body close to a raging fire. The idea behind it was that the heat and the colour would draw the fever outward, force the pox to surface on the skin rather than turning inward and attacking the vital organs. Whether the science of it holds up by modern standards is a separate conversation. What we know is that within 2 hours of the treatment beginning, Elizabeth began to speak again. Within hours, the eruptions broke out on her skin as the disease finally declared itself fully. And though that sounds like the beginning of something terrible, it was actually the turning point. Once the pox had come to the surface, the fever began to break. England's Queen was going to survive. There is a detail from those first hours of Elizabeth's recovery that I find almost unbearably poignant. When she regained consciousness, when she could speak, when she could make herself understood, the first thing she asked her council to do was not about the succession, not about the country, not about the crisis they had all been terrified by. She asked them to make Robert Dudley Protector of the Kingdom, with a title and an income of £20,000 in the event that she died. Even half conscious, even in the grip of the worst illness of her life, she was thinking about him, about what would happen to him without her protection. That request, recorded dutifully by her counsellors, was set aside once she recovered. Nobody was going to make Robert Dudley anything significant if they could possibly avoid it. But the fact that she asked in that specific moment when she had no reason to perform for anyone tells you something that no portrait ever could. Now Elizabeth survived, and by the 25th of October ambassadors were reporting that she was out of bed and already attending to the marks on her face. That phrase, attending to the marks on her face. After nearly dying, after the entire court had been paralysed with fear about the future of England, after a week of delirium and red flannel and midnight council meetings, the first thing she focused on when she could get out of bed was her skin. I want to be very careful here because it is easy to look at that detail and reach for the obvious interpretation. Vanity, pride, a woman too concerned with her appearance. But I think that reading is too small, too comfortable. What Elizabeth understood in a way that most of us never have to understand was that her face was not simply her face. It was a political instrument. She was 29 years old, unmarried, childless, ruling a kingdom that half of Europe thought no woman was capable of ruling. She was already older than the Tudor ideal for a bride. Every diplomatic negotiation she'd conducted in 4 years had involved at some level the question of her marriage ability, and her marriage ability was tied in the deeply unfair logic of the 16th century to her beauty. A scarred queen was a weakened queen. Not because Elizabeth herself believed that, but because the men whose cooperation she needed believed it, and she knew it. Her attendant, Lady Mary Sidney, had nursed her through the worst of the illness. Lady Mary was Robert Dudley's sister. She was a woman of great intelligence and personal warmth, well liked at court, one of Elizabeth's closest companions. She contracted the disease from the Queen. Her husband Sir Henry Sidney later wrote of what happened to her with a grief that is still painful to read 500 years later. He wrote that she was left after the smallpox as foul a lady as the pox could make her. He meant it with love. He said it in the context of explaining that he had never been repelled by it, never drawn away from her. But the words themselves are devastating. Mary Sidney withdrew from court life after that. She wore a heavy veil when she did appear. By the accounts of those who saw her, the woman who emerged from that illness was unrecognisable as the one who'd entered it. She had given her face to save the Queen's. Elizabeth never forgot it. She kept Mary in her circle, maintained her family's royal favour, made sure her children were looked after. But she also, and this is the part that gets under my skin, she also reportedly found it difficult to look at Mary directly. Not because she did not care. Perhaps precisely because she did. Because looking at Mary Sidney's face meant confronting what the disease had taken from her, and what it had almost taken from England, and what Elizabeth herself had been left carrying quietly in the form of scars that required management from that point forward. The substance she reached for was called Venetian ceruse. It had been in use among wealthy European women for centuries. Some form of it appears in records going back to ancient Greece and the Shang dynasty in China. In Elizabethan England it was made from white lead and vinegar, mixed together, applied to the face, the neck, the shoulders, left on. In some cases left on for days at a time with touch-ups applied over the top as needed. The effect was a smooth chalk-white surface that concealed discoloration, scarring the uneven texture of skin that had been through something difficult. It also over time corroded the skin beneath it. The lead combined with the moisture of the skin to form acids that ate slowly into the surface it was supposed to protect, which meant that the more damage it caused, the more ceruse was needed to conceal that damage. A cycle that fed itself, escalating year by year, decade by decade, toward an endpoint that nobody in 1562 could see clearly enough to prevent. Now I want to say something that I think gets lost in the retelling of this story. The popular image of Elizabeth in her later years, the enormous ruff, the elaborate wig, the chalk-white face laid on thickly enough that foreign ambassadors found it startling, tends to get described as vanity, as a woman unable to face the reality of aging. And I think that framing misses something fundamental. The thing Elizabeth was managing was not merely personal appearance, it was national stability. From 1563 onward, she had banned the production of unofficial portraits of herself. Artists who wanted to paint the Queen had to work from approved patterns she controlled, which images existed of her, and she controlled what those images were allowed to show. By 1596, the Privy Council ordered that any portraits depicting the Queen in ways deemed offensive or unseemly were to be found and destroyed. They meant portraits that showed her aging, and in the final years of her reign, an art historian named Roy Strong coined the term that has defined her image ever since the Mask of Youth. From around 1575, Elizabeth approved a specific portrait known today as the Darnley portrait, painted when she was roughly 41 as the official template for her face. For the remaining 28 years of her life, artists were expected to use that face. Not her actual face. That face. Frozen at 41, smooth, serene, ageless. Think about what that means for a moment. From 1575 until her death in 1603, no official image of Elizabeth I showed what she actually looked like. Every portrait, every miniature, every commemorative medal, all of them showed a version of a face that had stopped existing in real time. She had, in the most literal sense, manufactured an alternative version of herself and insisted that the world accept it as true. Now is there something uncomfortable in that? Yes, probably. Is there something that speaks to a deeper anxiety, a real difficulty with the gap between who she needed to be publicly and what she actually saw in the mirror? Undoubtedly. But there is also something else in it, something that feels less like vanity and more like an act of extraordinary political will. She understood that a queen's power was partly symbolic, that symbols erode when they appear mortal, that the spectacle of a 60-year-old woman with decaying teeth and thinning hair covered in the damage of decades of toxic cosmetics was not a spectacle that served the interests of England's stability. So she refused to allow it. She made a different picture, and she made everyone around her cooperate with it. Foreign ambassadors, to their credit, often could not be persuaded. They had to actually see her, and what they wrote home to their masters in the 1590s is a stark and sometimes startling counterpoint to the official portraits. The French ambassador André Hurault de Mace, who had an audience with Elizabeth in 1597 when she was 63, wrote a description that has survived the centuries in its unvarnished precision. He noted that her teeth were very yellow and unequal, that several were missing, and that it was difficult at times to understand what she was saying. He observed that her face was oblong, her complexion fair but wrinkled. He noticed that she wore an enormous red wig, and he noted with the careful diplomatic language of a man trying very hard not to give offence that her appearance was in considerable contrast to the portraits he had seen of her. Of course it was. The portraits were not portraits, they were arguments. Here is the thing I keep coming back to, though. The Venetian seeress, the wigs, the band portraits, the frozen face from the Darnley painting reproduced over and over for 30 years. All of it, every layer of it, was a response to something that happened in October 1562 in a bedroom at Hampton Court. To the moment when a young queen lay unconscious, the country suspended in terror outside her door, and a German doctor wrapped her in red cloth and brought her back. She survived, but the experience left her changed, not just in the obvious physical sense, in some deeper way that I think shaped everything that followed. She had felt her body betray her. She had felt the specific, terrifying helplessness of illness, of lying in a bed while the world outside discussed what to do if you stopped existing. She had seen what the disease did to Mary Sidney. She had understood in a way that is hard to understand until you've been that close to the edge yourself how thin the line is between presence and absence. And I think what she decided in the weeks after she recovered was that she was never going to be that vulnerable again. Not in public. Not in any way that could be seen. If the body was going to age and scar and decay, and of course it was because all bodies do, then the body that the world saw was not going to be that body. The world was going to see the face she chose, not the one she had been given. There is a kind of courage in that, I think, even if we are tempted to call it something else. She looked at the reality of what she was, a woman in a world that valued women primarily for their youth and their fertility, a queen whose authority depended partly on maintaining a certain kind of image, and she decided that she was going to control the narrative. She was going to write the story of her own face, not the painters, not the ambassadors writing home to foreign courts, not time itself, her, and yet. And there is always a yet with Elizabeth. The cerus was eating her face, the wigs covered hair that was increasingly thin, the teeth were going, the body beneath all the ceremony and the layers of carefully constructed image was doing what bodies do. Late in her life, Elizabeth ordered that all the mirrors be removed from her private chambers. She did not want to see. Whether that was wisdom or a kind of grief, I honestly cannot say. Maybe it was both. Maybe by that point, after 40 years of building a face that was not her face, and showing it to the world looking in a mirror felt less like seeing yourself and more like confronting a stranger. Let me ask you something. Have you ever thought about how much of what we present to the world is performance, not in a cynical sense, but in the simple human sense of knowing that what we show the people around us is not the entirety of what we are? Most of us do it in small ways. the face we put on for a difficult meeting, the version of ourselves we show to people we want to impress, the carefully maintained story of our own competence that papers over the moments when we are frightened and uncertain and unsure of the next step. Elizabeth did it on a scale that no individual has ever quite matched before or since. She performed herself into a legend, and the performance worked. We're still talking about it. We're still looking at those portraits. But behind the performance was a woman who had been terrified in a sick room at 29 and never quite forgotten it, who carried the weight of a mask that grew heavier with every year, who looked at Mary Sidney's face and then spent 40 more years making certain that nobody ever looked at her own face with that particular kind of pity. The body that survived 1562 ruled England for 41 more years. It rode into Tilbury to face the Armada. It danced at court into its 50s. It climbed stairs, it hunted. It endured the extraordinary physical demands of being queen in an age when being queen meant being on display almost constantly. And it did all of this while being quietly, systematically undermined by the very substances Elizabeth used to maintain the performance. The lead in the ceruse, the lead in the eyeliner, decades of daily exposure. Modern pathologists who have studied what is known of her final illness believe that chronic lead poisoning likely contributed to the deterioration that marked her last months. The thing she used to protect her image may have been slowly all those years doing something else entirely. There is a tragedy in that circle that I find hard to put words to without it feeling heavy, so I will not try. I will just say it plainly: the mask became the story. And the story, as it so often does, had costs that were not visible until it was too late to change course. But the mask was not only made of ceruse and pigment and careful portraits. There was another layer to the performance Elizabeth built around herself, one that was less visible, but in some ways more powerful. The performance of being unthreatened. The art of standing in a room full of men who were trying to manipulate you and smiling and giving them nothing to use. Because whatever was happening to her body, her mind remained one of the sharpest instruments in England, and the way she used it inside a court that functioned essentially as a grand theatre of flattery and deception is a story that deserves its own conversation. The courtiers who surrounded her, the spies, the favourites, the chess game she played day after day against a room full of people who thought they were playing it too. That is where we're going next, and I promise you it is not the story you expect. Something strikes me every time I read about the Elizabethan court. Not the grand processions, not the extraordinary gowns or the painted portraits or the elaborate ceremonies. What strikes me is how exhausting it must have been. Because behind all of that spectacle, behind the dancing and the flattery and the long evenings of music and performance, there was something else entirely. A constant low-level hum of danger, of calculation, of people watching each other while pretending they were not watching at all, and at the centre of it a woman who had learned from the very beginning of her conscious life that the safest thing you can do in any room is know more than anyone else in it, while giving no indication that you know anything at all. Elizabeth had a motto, 2 words of Latin carried quietly through her entire reign: Video et taceo. I see and I keep silent. That is not the motto of a passive person. That is the motto of someone who has thought very carefully about the relationship between information and power. It says, I am watching, I am paying attention, I am gathering, and none of you will know what I have gathered until I choose to use it. Elizabeth had embroidered onto some of her gowns the image of eyes and ears quite literally watching and listening, covering the fabric she wore on her body. The poet John Davies noticed this during one of her progresses through the country and wrote about it. The message was deliberate. The Queen sees everything, the Queen hears everything, and if you are in this court you would do well to behave accordingly. Now the men around her understood that they were in a chess game, but I think many of them underestimated which side of the board she was on. Take William Cecil. Cecil had been with her almost from the beginning. He became her principal secretary the very day she became Queen, November the 17th, 1558, at Hatfield House. He was brilliant, serious, deeply Protestant, intensely loyal to England in general and to Elizabeth in particular. He was also, and this is where it gets interesting, a man who believed sincerely, genuinely, as a matter of principle, that a monarch ruled best through the counsel of experienced advisers, that a queen specifically needed guidance, needed managing, not because he thought Elizabeth unintelligent. He was too perceptive a man for that, but because he believed that the proper ordering of the state required structured advice, and that the Queen should govern with her counsel rather than despite it. Elizabeth never fully agreed. She never said so directly because she was too clever to fight battles she did not need to fight. But across 40 years of working together there was a persistent quiet tension between them. Cecil pushing toward counsel and consensus, Elizabeth pulling back toward prerogative. She could accept his advice, she would not be bound by it. There is a wonderful story. Historians debate whether it is entirely apocryphal or rooted in something real, as with many of the best stories about Elizabeth, that Cecil once made the mistake of telling the Queen she must do something. She apparently looked at him with complete composure and said that the word must was not a word to be used with princes. Little man, she called him. This was her nickname for his son Robert, actually, who was physically small, and she used the same tone of arch, fond authority on both of them over the years. Must, she told him, is not a word for princes. The point landed. It always did. Because here is what Elizabeth understood that many of her counsellors did not fully grasp even after years of working with her. She was not simply managing a government, she was managing a narrative, and the narrative was there is one person in this court whose will is ultimately supreme. The council could advise, Parliament could petition, ambassadors could plead and cajole and threaten. She listened to all of them. She absorbed everything the way she'd been absorbing and processing and cataloguing information since she was a child who had learned that knowing things was the only armour that could not be taken from you. And then she made her own decision, in her own time, on her own terms. Francis Walsingham was a different kind of instrument altogether. Where Cecil was the voice of caution and institutional stability, Walsingham was the part of Elizabeth's government that worked in the dark. He became her principal secretary in 1573, and from that position he built something that had no real precedent in English history, a spy network. Not just a few informants the way every court had always had, an organised, systematic, wide-ranging web of agents and double agents and code breakers and provocateurs that extended across Europe, France, Spain, the Low Countries, Italy, even as far as Turkey and North Africa. Walsingham spent his own money on it, substantial amounts of his own money, because the Queen was famously reluctant to fund operations she could not see directly. He paid merchants and diplomats and priests and reportedly people of considerably lower standing than any of those, whoever could get him the information he needed. His personal watchword, which he developed early in his career and carried throughout it, was this: there is less danger in fearing too much than too little. He was a man who lived in a state of organised anxiety about threats to the Queen, not because he was timid, because he had read the intelligence, because he knew in specific and terrifying detail what was being planned in the courts of Catholic Europe, in the seminaries training English priests, in the private letters being passed between conspirators who thought their ciphers were unbreakable. He knew because his people were reading the letters, often before they arrived at their intended destinations. The Babington plot of 1586 is the crown jewel of Elizabethan espionage, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. because the common telling of it, young Catholic conspirators plot to free Mary Queen of Scots. Elizabeth, spymaster, uncovers the plot and foils it. The plotters are arrested and executed is accurate as far as it goes. But it leaves out the part that makes the whole thing genuinely extraordinary. Walsingham did not just uncover the Babington plot, he designed it. Or rather, he took a real conspiracy, a group of young Catholic men who genuinely wanted to liberate Mary and harm Elizabeth, and he quietly, methodically ensured that the conspiracy would produce exactly the evidence he needed. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. Mary Queen of Scots was being held at Chartley House in Staffordshire. Walsingham arranged for a double agent named Gilbert Gifford to convince Mary's supporters that a secret method of communication had been established: letters encoded in complex cipher hidden inside the waterproof bung of a beer barrel, delivered to and collected from Chartley. Mary believed this channel was secure. Her allies believed this channel was secure. They were wrong. Every letter that went in or out of that barrel passed through the hands of Walsingham's codebreaker, a man named Thomas Philippes. Philippes decoded them, read them, made copies, resealed them, and sent them on their way as if nothing had happened. For months, Walsingham let the correspondence flow. He let Anthony Babington write to Mary in detail about the plan, the Spanish invasion, the uprising of English Catholics, and the specific proposal to deal with the Queen. He watched. He waited. He needed Mary to respond. He needed her in her own words, in her own cipher, to signal her approval of the plan. On the 17th of July, 1586, she did. Her letter back to Babington outlined the components of a successful rescue and spoke clearly about the need for foreign support. And then those 5 words that Philippes apparently drew a small gallows symbol next to when he decoded them, because he knew what they meant. She gave her authorization. The evidence Walsingham had been building toward for nearly 2 decades now existed in ink, in Mary's own hand, in her own cipher. What happened next, the arrests, the trial, the eventual execution of Mary Queen of Scots in February of 1587, belongs to another part of this story that we'll come back to. But I want to stay here for a moment, because there is a question I find genuinely fascinating, and I think it is worth asking out loud. Did Elizabeth know the full shape of what Walsingham was doing? Did she know that her spymaster had in some sense engineered the very conspiracy that was now being used to justify executing her cousin? Historians disagree. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. Some believe that Elizabeth knew more than she ever admitted, that she was in her own way complicit in the strategy, allowing Walsingham to work, keeping her own hands visibly clean, maintaining the political fiction that she had simply discovered a plot, rather than helped construct its exposure. Others believe she genuinely did not know the details, that Cecil and Walsingham operated in spaces she preferred not to illuminate too closely. I think, and this is my own reading, take it as you like, I think Elizabeth was almost certainly aware that Walsingham's methods were not gentle. She knew what he was. She had appointed him because of what he was. And her motto, after all, was not, "I see and am surprised." It was, "I see and I keep silent." The court itself was a theatre of extraordinary complexity. 300 or 400 people at any given time in close proximity to the Queen, ladies in waiting who slept near her bedchamber, gentlemen of the household who attended her movements throughout the day, foreign ambassadors who wrote detailed dispatches home after every audience, courtiers who are constantly angling for favour, for appointments, for land grants, for access, and Elizabeth moving through all of it, watching, listening, playing what some historians have called the game of love with suitors and favourites, maintaining a kind of perpetual romantic tension with the men around her, flattering them, encouraging their devotion, keeping them in competition with each other. Not out of cruelty, I do not think. Out of calculation. A devoted courtier is a manageable courtier. A courtier who is competing for the Queen's favour is not building competing alliances or plotting against her. She used their adoration the way a chess player uses pawns, not dismissively but deliberately. She gave her favourite courtiers nicknames. Robert Dudley was her eyes, her sweet Robin. William Cecil she called her Spirit. Christopher Hatton, the tall and extraordinarily handsome Lord Chancellor, who was genuinely devoted to her, she called her Mutton, which is either affectionate or slightly bizarre depending on how you look at it, and honestly knowing Elizabeth's sense of humour, possibly both. Robert Cecil William's son, who was small in stature and served her in his father's role in the final years of her reign, she called her Pygmy, or sometimes her Little Elf. These nicknames mattered. They were a signal. They said, "You are in my circle. You're someone I have noticed. You have my attention." And in the Elizabethan court, having the Queen's attention was the difference between everything and nothing. But she also knew she always knew that having the Queen's attention could turn, that the warmth she could provide was real, but it was conditional, that every man in that court was at some level performing for her, and that she was performing for them in return. The difference was that she knew it was a performance. She'd been performing since childhood. She'd been reading rooms since she was old enough to understand that the people around her could decide whether she lived or died. Her court was the most sophisticated room she'd ever been in, and she was its most sophisticated reader. There is a particular exchange I keep coming back to when I think about how Elizabeth actually governed. In 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant for Mary Queen of Scots. She gave it to a secretary named William Davison, with explicit instructions that he was to hold it and take no further action until she commanded. She needed to sign it. The evidence was overwhelming the pressure from Parliament, and her counsel was enormous. The threat was real. But signing it and sending it were two different things, and Elizabeth, who understood better than almost anyone the weight of executing a fellow queen, wanted time, space, the ability perhaps to pull back if something changed. Davison took the warrant to Cecil, and Cecil, who had been trying for years to resolve the problem of Mary, and who knew from long experience that if he waited for Elizabeth to command the warrant sent, she might never do it, Cecil dispatched it. Mary was executed at Fotheringhay Castle on the 8th of February 1587. Elizabeth, when she found out, was incandescent. She raged. She blamed Davison, who was thrown in the Tower. She mourned in public the death of her cousin. She told everyone who would listen that this was not what she had wanted. And here is where it gets genuinely complicated. Was she telling the truth? Did she genuinely want Davison to hold the warrant, or did she want it dispatched and want the ability to deny it afterward? Or is the honest answer somewhere in between, that she both wanted Mary gone and could not fully let herself be the one who did it, so she allowed a mechanism to exist by which it could happen without her direct command, while knowing on some level that this was exactly what would occur? I do not think there is a clean answer, and I suspect Elizabeth knew there was not a clean answer. She was a woman who had learned to live in the space between what could be said and what was true, between what she needed to do and what she could allow herself to publicly want, between the woman and the queen, the performance and the person. What I find remarkable sitting with all of this is not the complexity of the deception. It is the cost of maintaining it. Every single day for 45 years she walked into a court full of people who had their own agendas, their own loyalties, their own versions of what England should be, and who should have the power to shape it. And every single day she had to be smarter than the room, had to be watching while appearing to be merely present, had to be calculating while appearing to be spontaneous, had to take in everything and give away as little as possible. I'm exhausted just thinking about it, which makes me wonder not for the first time what it cost her in the places no one could see. In the bedroom she never fully slept peacefully in the letters she never sent, in the decisions she made and then sat with alone in the dark hours before the court assembled again, because that is the thing about governing a kingdom through intelligence and performance and studied silence. You are never fully off the stage. You are never in a room where you can simply be confused or uncertain or tired or afraid. You are always the queen. And the queen, as Elizabeth had been demonstrating to the world for 30 years by the time the Spanish Armada appeared on the horizon, does not let you see her doubt. She shows you something else entirely. She shows you exactly what she wants you to see, which brings us to the summer of 1588, to a field at Tilbury, Essex, to a speech that has echoed down 4 centuries, and to the real story of what was happening inside the woman who delivered it, while the greatest military force in the known world was sailing toward her coast. The summer of 1588 arrived quietly the way summers do. Roses in the palace gardens, long evenings, the familiar rhythms of court-life musicians practicing somewhere down a corridor, the smell of candles and wood-smoke ladies stitching in afternoon rooms while advisors moved through the hallways with a speed that was not quite panic, but was not quite calm either. Because somewhere out on the Atlantic, growing closer with every passing week, was the largest naval fleet ever assembled in the history of the world. 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, somewhere between 18 and 26,000 soldiers, 2,500 guns. Spain called it the Invincible Armada, and Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who controlled the silver of the Americas and the armies of the Netherlands and the blessing of the Pope, had sent every last one of those ships and soldiers and guns toward the coast of England, toward her coast, toward Elizabeth. Let me take a step back and explain what was actually at stake in that summer, because I think the way we talk about it in retrospect, the famous victory, the Protestant wind, the bonfire on the hilltops, can make it feel inevitable. It was not inevitable. In the spring of 1588, England's finances were in a state that would make a modern Treasury official weep. Elizabeth had spent 45 years governing as frugally as possible because she had no choice. The Crown's income was limited. Parliament was reluctant, and she had a fundamental aversion to debt that was as much political as it was personal, which meant that when the Armada threat became undeniable, her Privy Council could only begin serious defensive preparations at the last moment. Leicester was still assembling the land army at Tilbury in late July while Spanish ships were already in the English Channel. The English naval fleet under Lord Howard of Effingham and Francis Drake had roughly 40 warships capable of serious fighting, with several dozen more armed merchant vessels pressed into service, against 130. Those were the numbers, and Elizabeth, whatever her public composure, was doing the same arithmetic as everyone else. Drake had bought England some time the previous year in April of 1587. On something like his own initiative, accounts differ on how much Elizabeth actually sanctioned this, and Drake was the kind of man who understood that it was easier to beg forgiveness than ask permission from a cautious queen. He sailed directly into the Spanish port of Cadiz. He destroyed over 30 ships. He burned 10,000 tons of seasoned barrel staves, the oak wood Spain needed to build the barrels that would carry food and water for the invasion fleet. He called it with the particular cheerfulness of a man who has just done something audacious, singing the King of Spain's beard. The attack pushed Spain's invasion timeline back by a full year. Walsingham, who had orchestrated much of the intelligence behind it, had anticipated this correctly. That extra year was used to shore up England's defences, improve the fleet, and build the coastal beacon system, a chain of fires on hilltops stretching across the country so that the sight of the Armada in the Channel could be communicated to London within hours. It was not enough to make the situation comfortable, it was enough to make it survivable. The Armada was sighted off the coast of Cornwall on the 19th of July 1588. The beacons lit, the fires spread. From hilltop to hilltop across the length and breadth of England, the warning travelled faster than any horse could carry it, and in the days that followed, the English fleet harried the Armada as it moved up the Channel, not quite winning, not quite losing both sides, taking damage, the great crescent formation of Spanish ships, maintaining its discipline despite everything the English threw at it. The decisive moment came off the coast of Calais. The Spanish Armada had anchored there waiting for the Duke of Parma to bring his 30,000 veteran troops from the Spanish Netherlands to board the fleet and cross to England. And in the middle of the night on the 7th of August, 8 English ships sailed into the anchored Armada. They were fire ships, loaded with pitch and brimstone and tar and gunpowder, set alight, sent downwind directly into the crowded Spanish fleet. The Spanish panicked. Ships cut their anchor cables and scattered. The tight crescent formation which had made the Armada so formidable and so difficult to attack broke apart. The next morning at the Battle of Gravelines the English closed in. The Spanish ships were scattered, confused, their ammunition running low. The battle was not a clean English victory, nothing in naval warfare that chaotic ever is, but the Armada was driven north past Scotland, unable to return through the Channel. The invasion plan was finished. Spain's fleet battered and blown apart by storms on the return journey around Scotland and Ireland lost more than half its ships. But here is the thing. None of that was known at Tilbury on the 9th of August 1588. The decisive naval engagement had happened 11 days earlier, but communications were slow. The Duke of Parma was still massing his troops in the Netherlands. It was not yet clear that the invasion was truly over, and at Tilbury on the Essex bank of the Thames, 16,000 English soldiers were waiting, many of them untrained militia, many of them poorly armed, many of them, according to contemporary accounts, anxious and uncertain in the way that men are when they have been told they are the last line of defence between their country and occupation. Elizabeth's council did not want her to go to Tilbury. This is worth understanding clearly. The risk was real. An assassination attempt would have been the simplest thing in the world. A queen moving through a large crowd of soldiers, some of them Catholic, some of them possibly with sympathies the government could not fully vet. Burghley wanted her in London. Other councillors wanted her further inland. Robert Dudley, who in what would prove to be the final act of a lifetime of service, had personally organised and commanded the army at Tilbury, had actually invited her, partly to give her something to do that was safer than her first impulse, which was apparently to ride to the coast herself to confront Parma's troops directly. I want you to think about that for a moment. Elizabeth's initial instinct was not to seek shelter, it was to ride toward the enemy. 60 councillors could not contain that particular impulse without providing an alternative. Tilbury was the alternative. She arrived by royal barge on the 8th of August. She reviewed the troops and then spent the night at a manor house belonging to a man named Edward Ritchie, a little over a mile from the camp. And the next morning, the 9th of August, she mounted a grey gelding. She wore a white velvet gown, over it a silver breastplate. A page carried her silver helmet on a cushion behind her. The Earl of Ormond walked ahead with the sword of state. Robert Dudley walked at her side. She rode out of the house down the causeway he had built for her through the gates of the camp, and 16,000 men turned to look at their queen. Now here is where I need to tell you something that most tellings of this story leave out, because the version we all know, the stirring speech, the armoured queen, the moment of national triumph, is real. But it is only part of what was happening. The historian Garrett Mattingly, writing about this moment with the particular clarity that distance sometimes allows, described what an objective observer would have seen on that field. Not a warrior goddess, not an icon made flesh. What he saw was a battered, rather thin woman in her middle 50s, on a horse with black teeth and a red wig sitting slightly askew, carrying a small decorative sword that would not have been much use in an actual fight. A woman who had been awake the night before in someone else's house, knowing that the most powerful military force in the known world had been sailing toward her country. A woman who had spent 30 years carrying the weight of a kingdom alone, without a husband, without a partner, without anyone beside her who bore the same responsibility. That woman rode out in front of 16,000 men. And she gave what many historians consider the greatest speech in the English language. She began by acknowledging what her advisers had told her, that she'd been warned, that some who were careful of her safety had said she should not commit herself to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. She told her soldiers she had heard that advice. And then she told them directly, clearly, without decoration, she did not want to live to distrust her faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear, she said, not her. I have always so behaved myself, she said, that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. She rode among them as she spoke, not from a platform, not from a distance. She moved through their ranks close enough for them to see her face. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, she said, and here is where the speech lifts into something that still raises the hairs on my arms 500 years later. But I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. She did not claim to be what she was not. She did not pretend that her body was capable of what a male commander's body was assumed to be. She named the weakness. She stood in it. And then she placed beside that acknowledged weakness something that could not be argued with, the heart and stomach of a king of England. In a single sentence she had refused the choice she was being offered, be treated as a woman or be treated as a king, and replaced it with a third thing. I'm a woman with a king's courage. Take both. That is what you're fighting for. I think about what it took to stand on that field and say those words. Not the words themselves, those could be prepared, and she was a woman who'd been preparing words her whole life. I think about what it took to ride out in front of 16,000 frightened men and make them feel in their bodies in the specific physical way that courage is contagious, that the person leading them was not afraid. When she was. She must have been, because she was a human being with a functioning mind, and she could read the intelligence reports as well as any man in her council, and she knew what Philip of Spain's army was capable of. She knew what it would mean if they landed. She had spent 30 years watching what the Catholic powers of Europe did to Protestant kingdoms when they got the chance. She was afraid, and she rode out anyway, and she did not show them the fear. She showed them the heart and stomach of a king. The chaplain Lionel Sharp, who was attached to Leicester's command at Tilbury, and who later wrote down the version of the speech that historians consider most accurate, said that after Elizabeth left the camp, she was commanded to have the speech redelivered to the full army the following day. It was that powerful, that important, that necessary for every soldier to hear. Sharp said he was the one commanded to deliver it, and he added in his account that no man had the speech but himself, and such as he had given it to. He was protective of it. Which suggests that even decades later he understood what he had witnessed. Not just a military rally, something rarer. A woman standing at the edge of an abyss, and choosing publicly and deliberately to turn and face it rather than look away. Robert Dudley died less than a month later. The last great thing he organised in his life was Elizabeth's visit to Tilbury. He died on the 4th of September 1588, while travelling north toward Kenilworth. He had been with her from the beginning. He was the boy she had known since she was 8 years old. He had built the causeway she rode down into the camp. He had walked at her horse's bridle as she gave the most famous speech of her reign. and then he was gone. Elizabeth, as I mentioned before, shut herself away when she heard. But she came out. She always came out. The performance did not stop. It could not. England needed Gloriana, and Gloriana, whatever the woman inside the armour was feeling, did not let anyone see the grief. Here is what I keep thinking about when I sit with the year 1588. In that single summer, Elizabeth faced the greatest military threat of her reign, gave the speech that would define her legacy for 4 centuries, and lost the person who'd been closest to her heart for nearly 40 years. 3 enormous things, all in the space of weeks, and she held together, not because she was made of different material than the rest of us, but because she had been practicing her whole life. She had been practicing since she was 2 years old and her mother disappeared, since she was 14 and learned that safety was a thing you manufactured, not a thing that was given to you, since she was 15 and sat alone in a room while a government interrogator tried to break her. Every one of those experiences had been building toward the summer of 1588, toward that grey gelding, toward that silver breastplate, toward those 16,000 men looking at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had come loose from its moorings. She gave them what they needed. She always gave them what they needed, even when there was a cost attached to it that nobody was allowed to see. The victory over the Armada made Elizabeth a legend in her own lifetime. Songs were written, medals struck, portraits commissioned. The Armada portrait painted shortly after the engagement shows Elizabeth at the height of her power, composed magnificent, one hand resting lightly on a globe of the world, the scene of the scattered Spanish fleet visible through the window behind her right shoulder. It is one of the most powerful political images ever made, and it is in the way of all great propaganda, both completely true and completely constructed. True because she really had survived what no one thought she could survive. Constructed because the woman in the portrait looks as though she had never doubted, never feared, never spent a night in a borrowed house wondering if the fleet she had sent out with inadequate funding against overwhelming odds was enough. She would have approved of both readings, because she understood perhaps better than anyone has ever understood that what people need from a leader in a moment of national crisis is not the truth of their private fear. It is the performance of their public courage. She performed it so well that 4 centuries later people still believe the portrait, but England's story was not finished, and neither was Elizabeth's, because even as the bonfires burned and the church bells rang and the country celebrated a victory that felt to those who had lived through the fear of it like nothing less than a miracle from God, there was still the question of what happened next. There was still the woman behind the armour, the one who had kept her composure in front of 16,000 soldiers and then gone home and quietly begun to grieve the death of someone she had loved since childhood. The one who was now undeniably in the second half of her life. The one who had spent 30 years refusing to look in mirrors and was now going to have to decide what it meant to grow old inside a performance that was never supposed to age. And there was still the young man waiting in the wings, ambitious, impulsive, brilliant in his own way, deeply dangerous, the one who had become the last great love of her life and the last great mistake. That story is closer than you might think. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes after triumph. Anyone who has been through something enormous, a crisis, a loss, a period of life-defining difficulty knows it. You survive, the world celebrates, and then slowly the people who were with you start to disappear. By the early 1590s, Elizabeth's world was doing exactly that. Walsingham died in 1590 quietly in debt, having spent most of his personal fortune on the spy network that kept her alive for 20 years. Christopher Hatton, the tall, devoted Lord Chancellor, who had been her mutton, and danced with her into the small hours dead in 1591. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, her spirit, the man who'd been at her side since the very first day of her reign, dead in 1598. Elizabeth sat at his bedside near the end, and by the accounts of those present fed him broth with her own hands. After he was gone, she said she'd lost her right arm, and Robert Dudley, her eyes, her sweet Robin, already gone since 1588. The old guard was departing, the court filling with younger faces, new names, different loyalties, and into that particular loneliness walked a young man with his stepfather's red hair and an ambition so large it had not yet learned to be afraid. Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, was born in November of 1565. His mother was Lettice Knollys, the woman Elizabeth had permanently banned from court after she married Dudley, which means Essex arrived at Elizabeth's court carrying already a complicated inheritance. He was the son of the woman Elizabeth could not forgive. He was the stepson of the man Elizabeth had loved. He was 21 years old when Dudley brought him to court in 1584. Elizabeth was 51. I want you to hold that age gap for a moment. 30 years. What followed has fascinated people for 4 centuries, and I think it is worth being honest about what it actually was rather than reaching for the romantic version. Essex was extraordinarily handsome. Tall with the distinctive Boleyn cheekbones, he was Elizabeth's first cousin, twice removed on his mother's side, which gave him a family resemblance that some contemporaries found startling. Charming. Physically brave in the way that some men are brave, the kind that does not stop to calculate consequences. And Elizabeth, 51 and increasingly isolated, responded to him the way she'd always responded to men of that particular type, with warmth, with attention, with the dangerous pleasure of being adored by someone who made the court feel alive again. His servant Anthony Bagger wrote home about those early years with a candour that is almost uncomfortable across 500 years. When Elizabeth was abroad in the palace, he wrote, nobody was near her but Essex. And at night Essex was at cards or one game or another with her so late that he came not to his own lodging until the birds sang in the morning. The birds sang in the morning. But here is what I think the romantic readings of the Essex story always miss. Elizabeth had been managing favourites her whole political life. She was not naive about what adoration from a beautiful young man meant or what it was for. She had played this game with ambassadors and foreign princes for 30 years. She knew every move. What made Essex genuinely dangerous was not his beauty or his charm. It was his absolute inability to understand that she was playing a game at all. Dudley, for all his faults and ambitions, had understood Elizabeth. He had known her since they were children sharing the same terrifying world. He understood on some level that her power was not performance, it was real. That her will was not a thing to be managed around, but the fundamental fact of the relationship. Essex never understood this, or perhaps more precisely, and I find this reading more sympathetic actually, Essex understood it intellectually and could not make himself believe it emotionally. He was a man of his time, a man who believed that female authority was at some level provisional, that a sufficiently forceful, sufficiently noble, sufficiently beloved man could eventually bend it. He was wrong. He was spectacularly, catastrophically, fatally wrong. And the tragedy is that his wrongness had nothing to do with Elizabeth's feelings for him. She was fond of him. She may have loved him in the way she was capable of loving someone she could never fully trust. But fondness and love did not change the fundamental equation. Elizabeth would not bend for anyone, not for Parliament, not for her council, not for the most powerful kings in Europe. She was certainly not going to bend for a 21-year-old with his stepfather's red hair and a spectacular talent for getting into trouble. The first serious crack appeared in the summer of 1587, barely a year into their friendship. Essex's sister was banished from court for marrying without permission. He confronted Elizabeth directly over it. not carefully, not with the diplomatic cushioning that every courtier understood was required when approaching the Queen on a sensitive matter. He confronted her. She screamed insults back at him about his mother Lettice, the woman she could not forgive. Essex galloped off into the night and went back to the Netherlands. He came back. Elizabeth let him come back. And this is the pattern that repeated itself with increasing severity for the next 14 years. Essex would push too far. Elizabeth would rage. He would leave or be banished. He would return. She would forgive him, until the time she did not. In the years between 1587 and the late 1590s, Essex accumulated enough genuine achievement to make the eventual catastrophe feel truly tragic. He was a real soldier, not a decorative courtier who wore armour in portraits he could actually fight. In 1596 he led the expedition to Cadiz that became his greatest triumph. The English fleet sacked the port, destroyed supplies, captured ships, embarrassed the Spanish crown. Essex returned to London as a national hero. He was 30 years old, brilliant, golden, admired by everyone. And Elizabeth characteristically found things to criticise. She questioned why he had distributed so many knighthoods in Cadiz. She controlled the distribution of honours with great care, and he had dispensed them freely, creating obligations that belonged to him rather than to the crown. He had been giving people loyalty to himself, she noticed. She always noticed. By the late 1590s, the court had divided into two hostile camps. On one side, Essex and his faction, military Protestant, aggressive in foreign policy. On the other, Robert Cecil William's son, physically small, politically brilliant, deeply cautious, committed to patience and the kind of quiet power accumulation that does not announce itself. Elizabeth managed the balance between them the way she managed everything, by refusing to commit fully to either side, keeping both uncertain, keeping both competing. But Essex increasingly could not tolerate uncertainty. He wanted to win. He did not understand that in Elizabeth's court, wanting to win outright was the surest way to lose. The breaking point was Ireland. In 1598, a rebellion led by the Earl of Tyrone had become a genuine crisis. English forces had suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of the Yellow Ford, nearly 2,000 soldiers dead in a single engagement, the worst military loss in Ireland in living memory. Elizabeth needed someone to fix it. In a council chamber argument about who should be sent, Essex had been so contemptuous of his colleagues and so convinced of his own rightness that he had turned his back on the Queen mid-discussion. He turned his back on her. Elizabeth slapped him. He reached for his sword. He caught himself barely. He stalked out, declaring he would not have tolerated such treatment from her father Henry VIII. He came back from that too, and Elizabeth, in either an act of great trust or a calculated decision to let him destroy himself in the field, sent him to Ireland in March of 1599. 17,000 men, the largest army England had ever sent to Ireland. Explicit instruction: defeat Tyrone. Essex failed. Not just fell short, he comprehensively, spectacularly failed. Instead of marching north to confront Tyrone in Ulster as ordered, he spent his army on inconclusive skirmishes in the south. He gave out knighthoods again without authority until more than half the knights in England owed their rank to him personally. He ignored letter after letter from Elizabeth, each growing colder and more furious. Her godson, Sir John Harrington, who was with the army in Ireland, later wrote that back at court, Elizabeth paced her privy chamber, stamped her feet at the news from Ireland, and thrust her sword into the wall hangings in her rage. That image stays with me. The old queen alone stabbing a sword into tapestry because she was too angry to stand still. In August 1599, Essex finally marched north to confront Tyrone. What happened at their meeting on the banks of a river ford was never fully recorded. The two men met on horseback in the middle of a shallow crossing without witnesses close enough to hear. They spoke for half an hour. Nobody else caught the words. Essex came away with a truce, not a surrender, not terms of submission. A truce negotiated in Elizabeth's name and without her permission that allowed the rebellion to continue essentially as before. Elizabeth's fury when the terms became clear was total, and then Essex made the worst decision of his life. Afraid, impulsive, convinced that his enemies at court were turning the Queen against him and that he had to reach her directly, personally, before they could. He abandoned his command. He crossed to England without permission. He rode through the night. On the 28th of September, 1599, he arrived at Nonsuch Palace at 10 in the morning, still covered in mud and the dirt of the road. He walked unannounced into Elizabeth's bedchamber. She was not yet dressed. Her ladies had not yet arrived. She had no wig on. She had no makeup, no ceruse, no painted youth, no mask. For the first and only time in their relationship, Essex saw what Elizabeth actually looked like beneath the performance. A 66-year-old woman in her private room not yet assembled into her public self. Contemporary accounts note that Essex was much wondered at in the court for going so boldly to her presence, she not being ready. Elizabeth kept her composure. She greeted him kindly. She said they would speak more later. He left thinking things might still be salvageable. He was wrong about that too. That afternoon the meetings grew colder. The following morning Essex appeared before the council for 5 hours. His truce was declared indefensible. His return without permission was declared desertion. He was placed under house arrest, and this time he would not come back from it, because that unannounced entrance into her bedchamber was not simply a breach of protocol, not just the final straw. It was the moment when Essex demonstrated beyond any possible argument that he did not believe Elizabeth's private self was entitled to the same protection he would have demanded for his own. He walked into her room, while she was unguarded, while she was unfinished, while she was for a few minutes each morning just a person rather than a queen. He walked in anyway because his need to explain himself outweighed whatever boundaries she maintained. I think Elizabeth understood exactly what that moment meant. Not just politically, personally. It was the same violation that had begun to form in her when she was 14 years old, and a man entered her room before she was dressed. The details were different. The shape of it was the same. The months of house arrest became a year. Essex wrote pleading, anguished, sometimes melodramatic letters. He called himself her creature. Elizabeth read the letters. She did not respond. In September 1600, she refused to renew his patent on the sweet wines trade, his single major source of income. Without it, Essex was financially ruined, and a financially ruined Essex was, as Robert Cecil and the Queen both understood, a predictably dangerous man. On the evening of the 7th of February, 1601, Essex's followers commissioned a special performance at the Globe Theatre, Shakespeare's Richard II, with the deposition scene the one normally cut because it was too politically sensitive. They paid 40 shillings above the standard fee. The message was not subtle. The next morning Essex and roughly 200 armed men marched through the streets of London shouting that the crown had been sold to Spain, that plots had been laid against his life. He expected the people of London to rise. The people of London went inside and shut their doors. Within hours, Essex was besieged in his own house. By evening, he had surrendered. Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Something in her resisted in a way that was different from the Mary Queen of Scots delay. With Mary, it had been philosophical, the horror of executing a fellow queen the precedent. With Essex, the resistance was more intimate. She delayed. She hesitated in a way that was not quite like her. And there is a story, historians argue whether it is history or legend, but it has survived 500 years. because stories that capture something true tend to survive about a ring. The story says Elizabeth had given Essex a ring in the early years of their friendship, a ring from her own hand. She had told him, "If you ever need my forgiveness, send this ring to me." When Essex was condemned, he tried to send it. He gave it to a woman named Lady Scrope, asking her to carry it to the Queen, but Lady Scrope gave it to her sister. Her sister was the Countess of Nottingham, whose husband was one of Essex's enemies. The Countess kept the ring. It never reached Elizabeth. Whether that story is true or not, Essex was executed on the 25th of February 1601 within the private confines of the Tower, rather than on Tower Hill. A private death was the mercy he had asked for. He was 35 years old, and when the messenger came to Elizabeth to tell her that Essex was dead, she was playing the virginals. She paused at the news, then she continued playing. I have thought about that moment for a long time. The Queen who had danced with him through the night, who had stamped her feet in fury over his failures, who had delayed signing his warrant in a way she had not delayed for anyone else. Playing her instrument, pausing, continuing. Some read it as cold, as political calculation reasserting itself over feeling. Others read the opposite, that the only way to hold herself together in that moment was to keep her hands moving, to do the next thing, to not let anyone in the room see what was behind the pause. I think it was both, and I think she knew it was both, and I think that is the thing that is hardest to look at directly about Elizabeth's final years. She had become so practiced at the performance that there was no longer a clean line between who she was and what she showed. The music continued, it always continued. After Essex, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way the court could name. But those who knew her best wrote about it afterward with a particular sadness. She became more withdrawn, more prone to long silences, more given to sitting for stretches without speaking, looking at nothing, her hands still. She was 67 years old. She'd been on the throne for 43 years. She'd outlived almost everyone she'd started with, and she'd just signed a death warrant for the last person who had made the court feel like it still had warmth in it. Even if that warmth had been ultimately a danger. The court moved on. Robert Cecil managed the succession quietly in the background, corresponding with James of Scotland, putting the mechanisms in place that would carry England through the transition with the minimum of disruption. Elizabeth, for her part, refused to discuss it. She would not name an heir. She would not acknowledge that the question existed. She had been telling people since 1559 that naming a successor was the best way to put a target on her own back, and she had not changed her mind in 40 years. But in the winter of 1602 she stopped being able to fight quite as effectively. Something was coming, something she could not be clever about, something she could not outmaneuver, and it was moving toward her through the cold English winter whether she named it or not. The final chapter of her story begins where she always did her best thinking, in the dark after everyone else had gone to bed in a room where she was finally briefly alone. Autumn 1602, Richmond Palace, a little upstream from London, the Thames going grey in the early cold. Elizabeth had been queen for 44 years. She was 69 years old, and something in that autumn began to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the people around her noticed it the way you notice the light changing in October gradually and then all at once. A string of deaths among her oldest friends had accumulated through that year into something that went beyond grief in the ordinary sense. In the winter of 1602 at Christmas she was at Whitehall Palace with a severe sore throat that would not fully clear. She sipped constantly from a drink to ease it, and still could barely speak above a whisper. She ate almost nothing. She told her godson, Sir John Harrington, that she was eating little, barely sleeping, and she seemed to him this woman he had known his whole life as sharp and energetic, and occasionally terrifying to have become forgetful, unusually gentle, as if something had quieted inside her that had always been loud before. The mere mention of the Earl of Essex, who had been dead nearly 2 years, could make her eyes fill and her face close. She had not forgiven herself for that warrant. She might never have forgiven herself. But let me stop here, because I want to tell you something that I think is genuinely extraordinary. In the final weeks of her life, Elizabeth did something that no Queen of England had ever done, and that no woman in her position could have easily done. She stopped performing. Not in the grand way. She did not abdicate, did not make speeches, did not announce a change. She simply quietly, incrementally stopped. And in that stopping for the first time in 69 years, the woman and the Queen began to become visible as separate things. In mid-February of 1603, Catherine Carey died. Catherine had been one of Elizabeth's closest companions for decades. Not a famous figure, not a political one, just someone who had been there, in the room, across the years. The kind of presence whose absence hollows out a space you did not know was being held until it isn't anymore. Elizabeth went to Buckingham Palace shortly after. The Venetian ambassador who came to see her there noted that she was absolutely covered in pearls, still maintaining the appearance of grandeur. He also noted a terse exchange between them about English piracy, during which Elizabeth gave him a cold look and said that the Republic of Venice only ever came to ask for something. That flash the quick tongue, the perfect calibrated put-down suggested the old Elizabeth. But something was different about her hands. They were swollen, and her coronation ring, the ring she had worn since her coronation day in January of 1559, the ring that symbolized in the specific language she had used for 45 years, her marriage to the Kingdom of England, had grown into her flesh. The doctors insisted it had to be cut off. Elizabeth agreed. When they removed it, she looked at the hand where it had been for so long, and the court, taking note, understood this as something that did not need explaining. February turned into March. By now Elizabeth was barely eating. The diarist John Manningham recorded from what those close to her were saying that she had been troubled with melancholy for 3 or 4 months, but for the last fortnight it had become extreme. She refused food, she refused medicine, she refused to go to bed. That last refusal, the refusal of the bed, is the detail that I find most haunting of all the accounts from those final days. She stood, for hours at a time. She stood in the middle of her chamber, her ladies unable to persuade her to sit or move or lie down, and she simply stood. At one point, according to those who witnessed it, she stood for 15 hours without sitting. When the ladies finally placed cushions on the floor, she allowed herself to collapse onto them, and she stayed there. On the floor. The Queen of England sitting on cushions on the floor of her bedchamber, her gaze fixed on the ground. Not sleeping, not eating, just sitting for days looking at nothing. Why? That question has occupied historians ever since. Some believe she was suffering from severe depression, the accumulated weight of 44 years of governance, the deaths of everyone she had started with the execution of Essex, the deterioration of her body into something she could not control. Some believe her physical illness, the swollen throat, the dental abscesses, the chronic lead poisoning from decades of cirrhosis, was causing pain so constant and so severe that she had simply stopped wanting to fight it. Some believe she was doing what she had always done in the most final way possible, refusing to be managed, refusing to be moved where she did not want to go. Because if she lay down in that bed, she understood with perfect clarity what it would mean. She had said it herself to Robert Cecil when he came to urge her to rest. He said she must go to bed. And Elizabeth, even now, even at the end, lifted her chin and said, "Must is not a word to be used to Prince's little man. Your father would not have dared use it. But you know I must die." She knew. She was choosing the manner of the knowing. Her cousin Sir Robert Carey visited on the 19th of March. He was the grandson of Mary Boleyn, which made him a blood connection to Elizabeth, going all the way back to the family she'd been born into, the family whose name her father had spent years trying to erase. He found her in one of her withdrawing chambers, sitting low on her cushions. She called to him. He knelt and kissed her hand. He said it was his greatest happiness to see her in safety and health, which he hoped would long continue. She took his hand and held it, wrung it hard, and said, "No, Robin, I am not well." He later wrote that she fetched not fewer than 40 or 50 great sighs as they talked. He had known her his whole life and had never once, he said, seen her fetch a sigh, except when Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed 16 years earlier, and even then only in private, only in a room like this one. 40 or 50 sighs. She told him her heart had been sad and heavy for 10 or 12 days. He tried to say the right things, the words that might lift something. He found them useless. He wrote afterward that her melancholy was too deep-rooted in her heart to be removed. And I think, reading his account, that Robert Carey understood something that the doctors and the ministers and the council did not quite want to acknowledge. She was not fighting the melancholy. She was finished fighting. On the 23rd of March, Elizabeth lost the power of speech entirely. She'd been mostly speechless for 2 days by then, occasionally murmuring, occasionally lifting a hand. That afternoon, by signs, by gestures, wordless and deliberate, she called for her council. They gathered around her. They asked her as gently as they could who she wished to name as her successor. Elizabeth raised her hand. She circled it slowly around her head, the gesture of a crown. When the name of James of Scotland was spoken aloud, she inclined her head. That was her answer. After 45 years of refusing to name an heir after Parliament, after Cecil, after 100 arguments about the succession that she had deflected or evaded or simply refused to engage with, she named him the only way left to her, without words, with her hands, one slow circle above her head. That evening the Archbishop of Canterbury came with her chaplains to pray with her. Robert Carey, still there, still waiting, sat on his knees at the edge of the room and wept. He wrote later that it was the heaviest sight he'd ever seen. At some point in the early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, the accounts differ slightly, Elizabeth's breathing changed. It slowed, and then it stopped. She died at 69 years old after a reign of 44 years and 4 months. Her ladies were with her. The room was quiet. What happened next has a strange poetry to it. Robert Carey had been waiting. He had positioned himself, horses staged at intervals along the Great North Road. The moment Elizabeth died, her Lady Philadelphia Scrope removed a sapphire ring from the Queen's finger, the ring James of Scotland had sent as a prearranged signal. She dropped it from the window to her brother Robert, waiting below. He caught it. He rode. 3 days later, having covered close to 400 miles at a speed that left his horses near collapse, and him reportedly bleeding from a fall along the way, Carey arrived in Edinburgh. James VI of Scotland was in his bedroom. Carey knelt before him. He told him Elizabeth was dead. He gave him the ring. And James VI of Scotland became James I of England, just as Elizabeth, with that single, wordless gesture of her hand, had said he should. The Tudor dynasty ended, not with war, not with crisis, with a man riding north through the dark and a ring and a whispered name. On the 28th of April, 1603, 5 weeks after her death, Elizabeth's funeral procession moved through the streets of London. The coffin was covered in rich purple velvet. On top of it lay her effigy, a life-size figure dressed in the full royal robes, crown on the head sceptre, in the hands, face painted to resemble her. The crowd that turned out to watch reportedly gasped when they saw it, not from grief alone. because it looked so real. It looked so much like her. And some witnesses wrote that people wept not when they were told she was dead, but when they saw the effigy, when the image of her passed, because the image was what they had always known, the real woman, the sighing woman on the cushions, the woman who stood in the middle of her room for 15 hours and could not bring herself to lie down. That woman had always been out of their reach. The image was what they mourned, and she'd crafted that image so perfectly, so deliberately over so many years that they would mourn it for centuries. I want to tell you something about her tomb. Elizabeth was buried first in the vault of her grandfather Henry VII in Westminster Abbey. 3 years later, in 1606, her coffin was moved to the Henry VII Chapel, placed in a new tomb erected by King James at his own expense. And beside her in that same tomb, sharing that same vault, was the coffin of her half-sister Mary. The two of them, the Catholic Queen and the Protestant Queen, the woman who imprisoned Elizabeth and the woman who had sometimes wondered in the Tower if she would die in that same building where Mary's mother had died, buried together. The inscription carved on the tomb is in Latin, and it reads, loosely translated, "Partners in throne and grave. Here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of the resurrection." Partners. That is the word they chose. Two women who had spent their lives in competition, in fear, in complicated proximity to each other's danger. Partners. History is not always subtle, but sometimes it manages something true. Here is what I keep coming back to in all of this. Elizabeth died having never married, never had children, never named a successor until a gesture in a room where she could no longer speak. She died with her coronation ring cut from her swollen finger, with a full inch of makeup on her face, with the last letter Robert Dudley ever wrote to her kept in a box beside her bed until the very end, alone in the specific way that the most surrounded people are sometimes alone. And yet, she had reigned for 44 years. She had kept England Protestant when every Catholic power in Europe was trying to reverse that. She had outlasted the Spanish Armada. She had outlasted Philip of Spain. She had outlasted everyone who'd ever said she was not capable, not legitimate, not worthy, not enough. She'd been the first English monarch to give her name to an entire age. And that age, the Elizabethan age, the age of Shakespeare and Marlowe and Drake and Spencer and 1,000 other things that still echo through the English language, would not have happened without her. Not because she was perfect, not because she was without fear or grief or miscalculation, but because she was exactly as complicated as the world she governed. And she never for a single moment pretended otherwise. I've been sitting with Elizabeth's story for a long time now, and the thing I keep returning to, the thing that I think explains more about her than any portrait or speech or political triumph, is the detail that she kept Dudley's last letter in a box beside her bed. She wrote on it in her own hand his last letter, and she kept it there for 15 years. Every night in the darkness that frightened her, in the sleepless hours that had always been her particular company, the box was there. The letter was there. The handwriting was there. The evidence that someone had known her, not the Queen, her. That I think is the quiet reality of Elizabeth I, not the golden portraits, not the armour at Tilbury, not even the extraordinary speech that has survived 4.5 centuries, the box by the bed, the letter, 2 words in her own hand, his last. We have more of her story still to tell, and in the chapters that remain I want to look at something most people never ask about. Not what Elizabeth achieved, but what the achievement cost. What it looks like from the inside to carry an entire country's fate on a single pair of shoulders for 45 years, and what it means that even at the end, even in a room where she could not speak, she used the only power she had left, the gesture, the lifted hand, the slow circle above her head to make sure that England would be safe. That is not the ending of a legend. That is the ending of a person. and it is the most honest thing about her. 30 days before her final illness took hold, 30 days before the cushions on the floor and the silence and the slow dissolve at the end, November the 30th, 1601, the council chamber at Whitehall Palace. 160 members of Parliament assembled, knights and burgesses, lords and commons standing before their queen. They had come initially on a matter of economic grievance. Monopolies granted to court favourites had been distorting trade and squeezing ordinary merchants, and Parliament was angry about it. The Queen, to her credit, had already agreed to address the abuses before they arrived, so when the Speaker and his delegation presented themselves at her feet to offer thanks, what followed was not the fierce, combative Elizabeth of the 1566 Parliament, who had screamed at 60 lords and commons for daring to question her prerogative. What followed was something altogether different, something that felt to those who were present that day like a farewell. She looked at them, these men who'd been haranguing her for 43 years about marriage and succession and policy, and the succession again, and the succession once more for good measure. These men whose fathers had some of them harangued her when she was 25. She was 68 years old, and she gave them something she had given almost no one in all those years. She gave them a piece of the truth. She told them there was no jewel she valued above their love. She told them that though God had raised her high, this she counted the glory of her crown, that she had reigned with their loves. And then she said something that I keep coming back to because it is so honest. It almost doesn't sound like a political speech. She said to be a king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that see it than it is pleasant to them that bear it. More glorious to them that see it than it is pleasant to them that bear it. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because Elizabeth did not say it carelessly. She had spent 43 years crafting every public word she spoke. She chose this. She wanted them to understand, perhaps for the first time, what the crown actually felt like from the inside. Not the golden weight of ceremony, not the mythic grandeur of Gloriana, the actual lived experience of being the person responsible for an entire kingdom, the loneliness of it, the nights, the decisions that kept coming and never stopped, each one carrying the weight of a country she had promised. At 25 she would love more than any man. She kept that promise, and she was telling them in the most measured possible way what keeping it had cost. But before we talk about what it cost, I want to do something slightly unusual. I want to look at what she actually built, because I think in the intimacy of this kind of storytelling sitting, with Elizabeth's losses and wounds and silences, it is easy to lose sight of the sheer scale of what happened during those 45 years. When Elizabeth became queen in November of 1558, England was a small, frightened, exhausted island. Mary Tudor had left it financially depleted, religiously divided, and strategically isolated. The country had just lost Calais, England's last territory on the French mainland, a national humiliation that still stung. The treasury was barely functional. The church was in turmoil, swinging back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism, with every change of monarch tearing families and communities apart. And the new queen was a woman, which by the assumptions of virtually every court in Europe, including her own, meant the real power would be held by whoever she married. 45 years later, Elizabeth died, leaving behind a country that would have been almost unrecognizable to the England she had inherited. Consider the numbers alone. When she took the throne, France and Spain were the dominant powers in Europe, and England was a secondary consideration in their calculations. By 1603, England had defeated the most powerful naval armada ever assembled. By the early years of her reign, 15,000 people a week were going to see plays in London. 15,000. In a city of perhaps 200,000 people. England had built its first permanent theatre in 1576, a building called simply the theatre in Shoreditch, and within a generation a carpenter's son from Stratford-upon-Avon named William Shakespeare would write works there that would still be performed in every language on earth 4 centuries later. In 1580, Francis Drake completed the first English circumnavigation of the globe and sailed into Plymouth harbour in his ship the Golden Hind. Elizabeth went down to greet him. She knighted him on the deck of his own ship. In 1584, Walter Raleigh received a charter to colonize North America. The colony he founded was named Virginia, in honor of her, the Virgin Queen. These things did not happen despite Elizabeth. They happened because of the particular environment she created. Not deliberately in the sense of a planned cultural program, but because what Elizabeth gave England more than anything else she gave it was something that sounds deceptively simple: stability. Not the stability of a country that never faced threats. She faced threats from every direction her entire reign. But the stability of continuity, of a single coherent authority that did not disappear every 6 years or fracture into civil war. The men who wrote the plays made the music sailed. The ships wrote the poetry. They grew up in a country that had one queen, and that queen had been there all their lives, and the country was Protestant, and those were the terms within which they could build their world. Shakespeare himself began writing near the end of her reign. He was 7 years old when the Armada came. He grew up in Elizabeth's England. He breathed its particular air of ambition and fear and glory. And when he needed to explore the dangers of power, the cost of ambition, the fragility of what we build, he set those questions in Rome, in Denmark, in Venice. Because asking them about England in 1600 was too close to home. Can I ask you something? If you think about the leaders, the places, the institutions that have shaped your own life, the ones that were simply there, stable and continuous, while you built your world around them, do you ever think about what it took to make them stable? Who held the thing together while you were getting on with living? Elizabeth held England together for 45 years. And I want to tell you what that actually required. We know she was an insomniac. She was afraid of the dark, not metaphorically, but literally. She slept with a bedfellow, a trusted companion who lay in or adjacent to her bed every night, partly for the warmth and security of another person in the dark. Even in her most private moments, she was never fully alone. And in those sleepless hours, the worries that she had managed so brilliantly during the day, managed through performance and calculation, and the careful art of giving nothing away, came back amplified. The fears of her enemies, the second thoughts about decisions made in daylight, the nightmares. She had an eye surgery at some point in the later decades of her reign. Accounts describe a surgeon coming from Italy to scrape cloudy film from her eyes. The procedure performed at 4 a.m, her hands secured to a chair while someone held her head still. No anaesthetic. 4 a.m. So the court would not see. So the performance of perfect health and undiminished capability could continue in the daylight hours. She wrote poetry. Not many people know this. She wrote it quietly, privately, in the way that private people use private forms. One of her poems on Monsieur's departure was written during the painful collapse of the Anjou match in the early 1580s, the closest she ever came to actually marrying someone. The poem is extraordinary. It reads like the inside of a mind at war with itself. I grieve and dare not show my discontent, she wrote. I love and yet am forced to seem to hate. I do yet dare not say I ever meant. I seem stark mute, but inwardly do prate. I am, and not I freeze, and yet am burned, since from myself another self I turned. Think about that last line, since from myself another self I turned. She is describing with the precision of a woman who had thought about it very carefully the specific cost of the performance, the bifurcation, the splitting of self into the woman who felt things and the queen who could not afford to show them. She'd done it so long that she was not sure anymore where one ended and the other began. She spoke 11 languages. 11. She translated from Latin and Greek and French and Italian as a teenager. She debated theology with scholars and held her own. She could deliver a speech in multiple languages and switch between them mid-sentence when diplomacy required. She played the lute and the virginals and the clavichord, and she practiced these not for show, but because music was the one place where the performance could be something genuinely personal. There is the story of the Scottish ambassador hearing her play through a door, and remarking that while Mary Queen of Scots was a fine musician for a queen, Elizabeth was a fine musician by any standard. She was told what he had said. She was delighted. Not because it confirmed her superiority over Mary, because it confirmed that something she had made with her own hands was genuinely good. Not political, not strategic, just good. She travelled. 25 times over her reign she conducted what the court called progress's journeys through the country that lasted weeks or months, visiting noble houses and cathedral cities and market towns, meeting her people face to face. She rode on horseback rather than by carriage whenever she could. She did this in her 60s. She wanted to be seen. She had learned somewhere early in that long education of hers that the relationship between a monarch and a people is not abstract, it is physical. You have to show up in person. And the people who saw her, the ordinary people lining the roads pressing forward for a glimpse, they were not seeing a political symbol exactly. They were seeing a woman on a horse who had reigned their entire lives, who had been there while they were born and grew up and married and buried their parents, who was still there. There is something in that continuity that cannot be manufactured, only endured. The price of it, though. I said I wanted to talk about the price. The surgery at 4 a.m, the lead makeup corroding the skin underneath, the insomniac nights with someone sleeping beside her so she would not be alone in the dark, the poetry she wrote and mostly did not show, the letter kept in a box for 15 years, the daughter of a woman who was dead before she was 3, who had learned to survive by giving nothing away, who had turned that survival into the governing principle of 45 years. What does it do to a person to live that way, to be so practiced at performance that you write a poem about losing yourself in it? I do not think this is a tragedy exactly. I think it is more complicated than tragedy. She chose this. At Hatfield under an oak tree at 25 years old, she chose it. She did not have to. She could have married, handed the actual work of governing to a husband, and retreated into the role the world had planned for her. She did not, and the choosing matters. But I do not think choosing something freely means it cannot cost you. The two things can be true at once. The golden speech is called golden for a reason, not just because of its eloquence, because of what it reveals. At 68 years old, standing before 160 members of Parliament, who had spent her reign demanding things from her, she finally said the thing she'd been circling around for 43 years. She said, "I was never enticed with the glorious name of a king or the royal authority of a queen. Never. What she had been enticed with, what she had actually wanted, what had actually driven her, was something she described in the same speech as being God's instrument. Not the crown, not the power, the purpose, the idea that she was here to defend this kingdom from peril, dishonour, tyranny and oppression. She believed that. She believed it the way people believe things they have tested against the hardest possible conditions and found still standing. And then she said something else, something that I think is the most honest thing she ever said in a public setting. She said, "For it is not my desire to live or to reign longer than my life, and reign shall be for your good. Not my desire to live or to reign longer, then my life shall be for your good." She was telling them in the language of statecraft that she understood her own purpose, that she had always understood it, that the crown was not the point. The people wearing the crown was not the point. What the crown was for, that was the point. And on that November afternoon, with less than 18 months of her life remaining, she gave them the clearest articulation she had ever offered of what she believed that purpose was. You have had and may have many mightier and wiser princes sitting in this seat, yet you never had nor shall have any that will be more careful and loving. 300 members of Parliament wept. Contemporary accounts describe it. They wept openly in that chamber while she spoke. And she for once, just this once, in the 43 years she had stood before them, she let them see that their tears moved her. She bent down and kissed the hands of those nearest to her. 53 years of a woman who had learned not to show what she felt, who had survived by giving nothing away, who had written poems about losing herself in performance. And in this room on this particular afternoon something shifted. She let them in, just a little, just enough. Here is what I think about Elizabeth sitting with all of it. She was not a saint. She was vain, stubborn, sometimes cruel in her pettiness, capable of extended sulks that her council found maddening. She procrastinated on every genuinely painful decision until the last possible moment, and then some. She was also by any honest measure one of the most remarkable human beings who ever held a position of power in the English-speaking world. Not because she was perfect, not because her reign was unmarked by terrible things it was, but because she took the most unlikely starting position imaginable and built something that lasted. The girl nobody wanted, the inconvenient one, the illegitimate daughter with the corrected birth announcement. She outlasted all of them. She built an age, and she named it herself in the way that only the people who actually do the building get to name things. The Elizabethan age, her age. I want to tell you one more thing before we move on. In 1595, when Elizabeth was 61 years old, and the Armada had been defeated, and the great crisis of her reign was behind her, Shakespeare wrote a play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it was performed at Greenwich Palace. At a wedding celebration, Elizabeth attended. She was 61 years old in her elaborate gown, and her red wig, and her inch of lead makeup, watching young actors tell the story of people tangled in love and magic, and the particular comedy of not knowing what you actually want. And the play contains a speech, one of the famous ones, about how the imagination transforms things. The lunatic, the lover and the poet Shakespeare wrote are of imagination all compact. The poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven. And as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes, and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. A local habitation and a name. That is what Elizabeth gave England. Not just in the obvious political sense, but in the deeper cultural sense that the Elizabethan age represents. She gave the imagination of a people a habitation and a name. She created the conditions in which Shakespeare could exist, in which Drake could sail in, which Spencer could write, in which the English language could become what it became. She gave airy nothing a local habitation, and the name was hers. But even all of that the age named for her, the plays that still run the language shaped by writers who breathed her particular air, even all of that does not fully capture what I keep coming back to, which is something smaller. A woman in a room, writing a poem she mostly did not show to anyone. I grieve and dare not show my discontent. I love and yet am forced to seem to hate. That woman, the one behind the performance. She is the one I find myself thinking about in the small hours, the way you think about people you've been thinking about for a long time. She bore the weight of a kingdom. She bore it well. She bore it alone. and she barely let anyone see how heavy it was. There are 3 more chapters to her story that I want to share with you. Not about the public Elizabeth, about the private one, about the Virgin Queen, what that title really meant and what historians have uncovered in the centuries since, about what it truly cost, about the woman who chose England over every person she might have loved, and about what that choice looks like from the inside in the specific and unsparing way that history sometimes allows us to see if we look carefully enough. Stay with me. Let me tell you something that took me a long time to fully understand about Elizabeth. The title Virgin Queen, those 2 words that have followed her through 4 centuries of portraits and pageants and school textbooks, was not something that happened to her. It was something she made, carefully, deliberately, over decades, out of nothing more or less than political necessity and a complete refusal to be defined by other people's terms. And it was one of the most brilliant acts of personal rebranding in the history of the Western world. That is the part everyone knows, or at least half knows. But there is another part, the part that rarely gets told, what it actually cost to live inside that particular construction for 45 years. Start with the obvious question. Was Elizabeth actually a virgin? Historians have argued about this for 4.5 centuries, and the honest answer is nobody knows for certain. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. What we do know is this. She was never married, she never acknowledged a child, and the cult of her virginity was by the 1570s a fully operational political machine, not simply a personal description, but a system of imagery and poetry, and pageantry and portraiture that was doing specific calculated important work for the stability of the English state. Whether the woman inside the machine was literally what the machine claimed is in some ways a separate question from how that machine worked and what it was for. England in the 1550s had just been through a religious upheaval that its population was still trying to process. Henry VIII had broken with Rome. Edward VI had pushed England toward hard Protestantism. Mary I had burned nearly 300 Protestant believers at the stake trying to drag it back to Catholicism. And now Elizabeth had to somehow hold all of these people, the reformers, the conservatives, the terrified Catholics who expected another reversal, the fervent Protestants who expected a crusade in a country together, without sparking civil war, without choosing sides so decisively that she lost half the population. She needed a symbol that belonged to everyone, that could mean different things to different people simultaneously. That was larger than politics, larger than religion, something ancient, something sacred, the Virgin Mary. For 1,000 years, the most powerful female symbol in the European imagination, the pure mother, the Queen of Heaven, the figure through whom divinity descended into human history. Catholic England had been devoted to her. Protestant England had smashed her statues and whitewashed her chapels and stripped her feast days from the calendar. But you cannot simply erase a millennium of devotion. You can redirect it. Elizabeth's image makers and Elizabeth herself, who was too intelligent not to have understood exactly what was being done, began to overlay the Marian imagery onto her. Pearls appeared in her portraits. Pearls were the traditional symbol of the Virgin Mary. The crescent moon appeared in her jewellery. The moon was Diana, the chaste huntress, but also the symbol of purity of light in darkness. By the 1570s, poets were calling her Astrea, the classical goddess of justice, who had ruled during a mythical golden age, the last of the immortals to leave the earth when humanity grew wicked. Others called her Gloriana, Cynthia, Belphoebe, Pandora, each name reaching into a different corner of the imagination, layering meaning upon meaning until Elizabeth had become not just a queen but an idea, something untouchable, something that could not be simply deposed or married off or replaced, something that existed on a different plane from ordinary political calculation. Here is where the genius of it becomes clear. When a Protestant state banned images of the Virgin Mary as idolatry, what it could not ban was the underlying human need that those images had been serving, the need for a sacred feminine figure, for purity associated with power, for the idea that there exists somewhere a woman who has not been compromised by men, by marriage, by the calculations of the body. Elizabeth stepped into that space, not accidentally, with full awareness of what she was doing. In 1559 she told Parliament plainly in the end, "This shall be sufficient for me, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen having reigned such a time lived and died a virgin." She said that at 26 years old, before the cult had fully formed. She was already building the image, already understanding that the image would outlast the woman. But here is the thing that I think gets lost in the analysis, because we are so accustomed to reading Elizabeth as a political strategist, which she was certainly, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that she was also a person, a woman, who wanted things, who felt things, and who spent 45 years constructing a public identity that placed everything she might have privately wanted behind a wall of sacred inaccessibility. What does that actually feel like from the inside? Think about the men, not just Dudley, whose story we have already told, the others, Christopher Hatton. He first caught Elizabeth's attention at a ball in the early 1560s. She noticed his dancing, which was apparently exceptional, and that became the beginning of a relationship that lasted until his death in 1591. Hatton wrote her letters that read even across 500 years like the expression of genuine, overwhelming feeling. He wrote, "To serve you is heaven, but to lack you is more than hell's torment. Would God I were with you but for 1 hour. My wits are overwrought with thoughts. Passion overcometh me. Love me, for I love you." He never married. He stayed single his entire life, in hope. She called him her mutton and her lids, and gave him Corfe Castle, and made him Lord Chancellor. She kept him close. She never married him. When he died in 1591, heavily in debt, having spent his fortune maintaining his position at court, it was said she wept at his deathbed. Walter Raleigh came later. Tall, brilliant, a poet who actually understood her, in the way that men who are themselves writers sometimes understand the people they are drawn to. He wrote verses about her as Cynthia the moon goddess that were not merely flattery. They were an attempt to see her, to describe something real about what she was and what she cost to be around. Elizabeth was deeply fond of him, and then in 1591 she discovered that Raleigh had secretly married one of her ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Throckmorton. She threw them both in the Tower. Raleigh spent weeks sending increasingly desperate letters and verses from his cell, claiming that without his queen's presence his life was nothing. Elizabeth eventually relented and released them both, but she did not forget, and she did not forgive Raleigh easily, because the thing you must understand about Elizabeth and the men around her is this: she was profoundly, sometimes terrifyingly jealous, not of the women they married, not exactly, but of the emotional energy, of the hours, of the attention that went somewhere else. Her court was structured around devotion to her. In her view, and she enforced this view with extraordinary consistency, love-making, except to herself, was criminal at court. That is not a metaphor. She literally believed that the men around her owed her their adoration as a form of loyalty to the crown, and when they redirected it, she felt it as a form of betrayal. Now I want to be careful here, because it is very easy to look at that and say she was a tyrant, jealous and controlling and unable to let people live their own lives, and that reading is not entirely wrong. But I think it misses something. Consider the position she was actually in. She was a woman ruling in a world that had never been designed for women to rule. Every relationship she had with her council, her favourites, her ambassadors, her parliament was shaped by the fundamental fact that the moment she allowed a man to become her primary emotional attachment, the world would start treating him as the real power, the husband who was not king, the advisor who was not officially the queen, the favourite who was managing her. She had watched this happen to Mary. She had watched Philip of Spain slowly pull the strings of a marriage that was supposed to give him no authority, but gave him enormous influence. She was not going to be managed. She was not going to let someone else become the centre of gravity in a court that was supposed to orbit around her. So she kept everyone circling, never quite giving herself, never quite refusing, always the possibility, never the reality. The Anjou courtship is perhaps the most revealing of all, and the one that breaks my heart a little when I read about it carefully. Francois Duke of Anjou and Alençon was the youngest brother of the French king. He was 22 years old. Elizabeth was 45. He was by many accounts not conventionally handsome. He had survived smallpox in childhood and bore the marks of it on his face. But he came to England in person, which none of her other suitors had ever done. They had sent ambassadors. They had negotiated through intermediaries. They had treated the courtship of the Queen of England as a diplomatic transaction conducted by proxies. Anjou came himself. He sat with her. He walked in her gardens. He talked with her. He was apparently charming in the way that men who are comfortable in their own skin can be charming. And Elizabeth, who had spent her entire adult life surrounded by men performing devotion, responded to the reality of him with something that looked very much like genuine affection. She called him her frog. She wrote him letters. She wore a ring he gave her. Contemporary accounts describe the two of them walking arm in arm through the public rooms of her palaces. Elizabeth clearly delighted, her court clearly astonished. In November of 1581, when she was 48 years old, and most of Europe had long since written off any possibility of her marrying, she apparently accepted his proposal. She did it publicly, in front of witnesses. She kissed him, and then that night, that same evening, she gathered her ladies and talked to them about the dangers of childbirth, and the next morning she told him she could not do it. She returned the ring. He eventually left England. She was reportedly devastated. She spent what those around her described as days in grief, and she never seriously considered marriage again. Why did she pull back? Historians have argued this for centuries. The political objections were real. Her Protestant subjects hated the idea of a French Catholic king consort, and her council was divided down the middle. But I do not think that is the whole story. I think Elizabeth at 48 knew what she was. She was the Virgin Queen. She had been the Virgin Queen for 20 years. The entire structure of her power rested on the idea of a woman who had chosen England over personal desire, who had sacrificed the ordinary life of a wife and mother, who was in some quasi-sacred sense wed to the kingdom. If she married Anjou, if she stepped down from the altar she'd been building for 2 decades, what happened to the myth? What happened to Gloriana? What happened to Astrea, the goddess of justice who would rule until the end of the world? She would become a middle-aged woman with a young husband and probably no children, and a court that would start looking to him for guidance instead of her. She would lose the thing she had spent her whole reign constructing. There is a question I keep turning over in my mind. Which one was more real? The woman who walked in the garden with Anjou and wore his ring, and wanted for a brief period to simply be a person who loved someone and was loved back, or the queen who understood by daylight what the ring would cost? I think the honest answer is that they were both real. And the tragedy, if that is the right word, and I am not sure it is that they could not coexist. She had built the brand so well that even she could not escape it. Think about what she gave up, not just in the obvious sense, but in the day-to-day sense. She never had a morning where she woke beside someone who knew her truly. She never had a person to whom she did not have to perform. She could be warmer with Dudley than with almost anyone else, but even with him there was always the court, the watching eyes, the political calculation just beneath the surface of every conversation. She wrote in that poem about Anjou, I am and not I freeze and yet am burned. I am and not, two selves, never fully either. But here is where I want to push back a little against the pure tragedy reading, because I think that misses something important too. Elizabeth made choices, real ones. At every fork in the road, she chose the road she chose. When she could have handed power to a husband at 25, she did not. When she could have married Dudley, even knowing the cost, she did not. When she held Anjou's ring and might have kept it, she gave it back. She was not a victim of the Virgin Queen myth. She was its author. And I think there was something in her forged in those early years of near total powerlessness, of being at the mercy of other people's decisions about her survival, that genuinely valued her independence more than she valued the ordinary pleasures it cost. Not because she did not feel their absence, but because she had decided very early that there was something she valued more. The ability to be the one who chose, not to be chosen, not to be subject to someone else's mercy, to choose. The Virgin Queen at its deepest level was not about purity. It was about sovereignty. Not just sovereignty over a kingdom, sovereignty over herself. The one thing a married woman in the 16th century could not have. The one thing Elizabeth was not willing to surrender, at any price. And now I want to ask you something not rhetorically. Do you think that was worth it? There is no correct answer. History does not grade us on this. But it is the question I find myself asking in the small hours when I think about this particular life. She chose power over intimacy. She chose sovereignty over companionship. She chose the marble stone and the marble inscription over the children she might have held. Was it worth it? I think she would say yes. I think she said yes in every choice she made, every time she handed back a ring, or turned a man's adoration into a political instrument, or refused to make herself legible in the way that the world wanted women to be legible. But I also think in the room with the cushions on the floor in the final winter, I think there were moments when the answer felt less certain, when the box beside the bed and its single letter felt like the only honest accounting of what the sovereignty had cost. The story of Elizabeth and the meaning of the crown she wore is almost complete, but there are two things we've not yet fully talked about. One is the way she's been remembered, the mythology that formed around her after her death, and what it reveals about the needs she met in people that went far beyond anything purely political. The other is what it means right now in this moment to think about a woman who built a world with her bare hands and then sat alone in it. That reflection is worth one more quiet evening. Stay with me a little longer. Something interesting happens to powerful people after they die. The complicated ones, the ones who were difficult and contradictory, and human in all the ways that humans are human, they get simplified. The rough edges get worn down, the hard decisions get reframed, the loneliness and the grief and the moments of doubt get quietly set aside. What remains is the version of the person that the world needs them to be. Elizabeth got this treatment faster than almost anyone. Within months of her death, the process had already begun. Consider the specific condition of England in 1603. James VI of Scotland arrived in London that spring to cheering crowds. He was greeted with extraordinary warmth. He was 40 years old, experienced in government Protestant, married with children, everything Elizabeth had not been in that last category at least. He knighted over 300 men during the procession from Edinburgh to London. 300 knighthoods in a few weeks. Elizabeth had created 8 new peers in 45 years. 8! James created 62 in his first years alone. The English nobility, who had spent 4 decades carefully managing a queen who used scarcity as a tool of power, suddenly found themselves in a court of abundance. It was intoxicating, for a while, and then, almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but in the specific grinding, gradually worsening way that things go wrong when a country has been under extraordinary management for half a century, and suddenly that management disappears. James did not understand Parliament. He understood absolutism, the divine right of kings, the theory that a monarch's will was God's will, the idea that a king answered to no earthly authority. Elizabeth had believed something similar in her bones, but she had also understood that believing a thing and acting on it are 2 different calculations. She believed in her absolute prerogative. She also sat through hundreds of parliamentary sessions, listened, argued, charmed, retreated when she needed to, and managed the relationship like the long, complicated dance it actually was. James simply did not do that. He told his first Parliament that kings were like gods on earth. Parliament did not find this as compelling as he expected. James's court filled quickly with his Scottish favourites, men who were strangers to England, who knew none of the customs and few of the courtiers, and nothing of the careful balances Elizabeth had maintained. The English nobility resented it, resented them, resented the fact that the old careful rituals of access and favour were being replaced by something messier, more expensive, more chaotic, and something else. Something that was never openly said but was apparently widely thought. A contemporary epigram circulated passed hand to hand in manuscript that reads today as one of the more pointed political jabs of the 17th century. It said Elizabeth was king. Now James is queen. You can read that as a comment on James's sexuality, which historians have debated at length. But I think it was also something more pointed than that. It was a comment on authority, on the specific quality of presence, on the difference between a monarch who walked into a room and made every person in it feel the weight of her attention, and one who did not. Elizabeth had that quality to an extraordinary degree. James, whatever his genuine intellectual gift, apparently did not, and so it began. The nostalgia. Not immediately and not all at once, but building through the first decade of James's reign into something that the poets and playwrights who had spent Elizabeth's final years writing cautious, worried plays about the death of leaders and the chaos that followed began to give voice to openly. Thomas Dekker and Thomas Heywood wrote plays that set Elizabeth's reign in golden retrospect, calling her the Blessed Queen and the Great Elizabeth, in terms that made clear they were commenting obliquely but unmistakably on the present by contrasting it with the past. The myth of Good Queen Bess began to form, not because Elizabeth had been an uncomplicated ruler. She had not been. She had burned her share of people and starved Irish communities, and executed her cousin, and occasionally made decisions that anyone with full information would struggle to defend. But the myth did not form around those things. The myth formed around the feeling of being governed by someone who cared, who showed up, who was still there year after year, visible and present and paying attention. Here is a detail I find remarkable. The people who lined the roads of London during Elizabeth's funeral procession in April of 1603, who came out in their tens of thousands to watch the coffin pass, many of them had never known another monarch. If you were 40 years old in 1603, Elizabeth had been queen your entire remembered life. She was not just a ruler, she was the background condition of existence. The fact that England was Protestant was her. The fact that there had been no civil war was her. The fact that Drake had sailed around the world and Shakespeare was writing plays, and the language itself was being shaped into something new that was in some deep and not fully articulable way her. and now she was on a cart under purple velvet with a wax effigy on top that looked disturbingly real. Contemporary accounts describe people weeping in the streets, not just polite mourning, genuine open public grief. The historian John Clapham, who worked in William Cecil's office for many years and knew the court from the inside, wrote about this afterward. He noted something careful and honest. He said that many of those who had complained most about her in her later years, those who had found her governance difficult, her delays maddening, her emotional demands on the court, exhausting, were among those who mourned her most openly when she was gone. I think that is very human. We rarely understand what someone was doing until they stop doing it. We rarely appreciate the architecture of a life until we are standing in the rubble of its absence. Can I ask you something? Has there ever been a person in your life, a teacher, a parent, a boss, someone you found demanding or complicated or difficult to read, whose absence when it came revealed what they had actually been holding together? The thing you had taken for granted, the stability you had not noticed, the daily management of 10,000 small things that had kept the structure sound. Elizabeth, for the English people of 1603, was that person, at a national scale. Now let me tell you something about the myth that I think reveals more than it intends to. The myth of good Queen Bess, the golden nostalgia for the Elizabethan age that formed almost immediately after her death and has never fully dissipated in 4 centuries, is not primarily a myth about Elizabeth's politics. It is not primarily about the Armada or the Protestant settlement or the financial management of the crown. It is a myth about a particular quality of presence, about someone who was there, who was paying attention, who looked you in the eye during those royal progresses and actually registered you as a person, standing on the road pressing forward to see your queen. Walter Raleigh, writing years after her death trying to articulate what had been lost, said something that I keep coming back to. He said England had not another like her. 5 words. Coming from a man who had been imprisoned in the Tower on her orders for marrying without permission, who had spent years navigating her jealousies and her moods and her political calculations. England had not another like her. There is a famous line from a historian writing about James in contrast to Elizabeth. James the historian noted neglected the business of government for leisure, the hunt his favourites, his private pleasures. His later dependence on favourites at a scandal-ridden court undermined the respected image of monarchy so carefully constructed by Elizabeth. That phrase, so carefully constructed by Elizabeth. It acknowledges, even in retrospect, that what Elizabeth had done was not natural or automatic or easy. It was work. Constant, deliberate, 45-year work. The careful construction of an image. The performance of presence. The management of a court and a country through sheer force of attention. James came in, and in a few years of drift and favouritism and parliamentary conflict, it began to come apart. Not completely, not irreversibly, but enough that people felt the difference, enough that the plays started being written about Blessed Queen Elizabeth, enough that the epigrams started circulating. Here is what I think is the most honest thing I can say about Elizabeth's legacy. She was not a perfect queen. The historians who have gone back to the records of her Irish policy in particular have found things that are genuinely difficult to read. The scorched earth, the famines, the deliberate cruelties visited on civilian populations in the name of suppressing rebellion. Elizabeth was not removed from those decisions, she sanctioned them. The poet Edmund Spenser, who himself had lived in Ireland and witnessed much of it, wrote that the Irish had been brought to such wretchedness as any stony heart would have rued. That was happening under Elizabeth's governance at the same time as Shakespeare was writing and Drake was sailing and the Renaissance was flowering in London. The Golden Age had a shadow. It always does. But I think what makes Elizabeth worth thinking about, worth sitting with in the quiet the way we are sitting with her now, is not the ledger, not the tallying of achievements against failures. It is something more specific, more personal, more strange. It is the fact that she took the most hostile possible circumstances born. A girl declared illegitimate, her mother killed before she was 3. Her title stripped her. Future uncertain, the world confident that she would either die in a prison or be married off to someone useful, and she made something permanent out of it. Not perfect, permanent. She outlasted every single prediction of her failure. She outlasted every man who doubted her. She outlasted her own body's attempt to kill her at 29 in that sick room at Hampton Court. And she did it by becoming, over decades of practice, the most complete version of herself that circumstances allowed. The word that keeps coming back to me when I think about Elizabeth is not the word that the history books usually reach for. They reach for great, magnificent, a golden age. The word that keeps coming back to me is precise. She was a precise person. In the way she used language, she never said more than she needed to say. In the way she used silence, she understood that not answering could be more powerful than any answer. In the way she built the myth of the Virgin Queen, not by inventing it wholesale, but by recognizing what was already in the cultural imagination and stepping into it with absolute clarity of purpose. In the way she kept Dudley's letter, 2 words, his last, precise. Think about what it takes to be that precise about your own life, to know with that kind of clarity what you're choosing and what you are forfeiting, to see the world clearly enough, including the parts that are unjust, including the parts that are costing you something you cannot replace, and still choose your path with open eyes, to build a box beside your bed and know what goes in it. There is something in that, I think, that speaks to something beyond Elizabeth's specific historical moment, something that belongs to anyone who has ever had to build a life out of materials that were not quite right for the purpose, anyone who has had to decide at some fork in the road which version of themselves they were going to be, anyone who has ever carried a grief they could not put down in public. Elizabeth lived in the 16th century. She navigated a world that was in specific and important ways more brutal and more constrained than the world most of us inhabit. She had less freedom in many formal senses than any of us sitting here now. And yet, what she did with the freedom she claimed inside the constraints against the odds in the space she carved out through intelligence and performance and the sheer relentlessness of her will is not a 16th century story. It is a human story, the story of someone who looked at what they'd been given and decided to make it into something, not something perfect, something real. The writer Thomas Dekker in 1603, just after Elizabeth died, wrote a piece called The Wonderful Year. In it he described the English people's reaction to her death. He wrote that she had ruled over her people for 45 years, about half as long as most of them had any cause to expect to live, and that when she died, nearly 70 years old, there were very few alive who could recall that another sovereign had ever sat on the throne of England. She'd been there so long that the country could not quite remember being without her, and she retained, he wrote, to the last the love and worship of a nation accustomed to a monarchy, clothed in the splendour of divine right, but also embodied in palpably real people. Palpably real, that phrase. She was real to them, not just a symbol, not just a face on a coin, real. Even behind all the cerros and the wigs and the frozen portrait and the myth she had so carefully constructed around herself, they felt the reality of her. They sensed a person in there, and they loved that person, even when they could not see her clearly, even when she would not let them see her clearly. I have been thinking about something for a long time, and I want to say it now near the end of this story. We tell Elizabeth's story as a story about power, about a woman who seized power and held it against all expectations, and that is true. But I think it is also a story about something that does not get named as often, something quieter, something that happens not in council chambers or battlefields or speeches, but in the private hours. It is a story about the decision to keep going, after the Tower, after Seymour, after the smallpox, after every man she could not marry and every person she outlived, and every decision she made and then sat with in the dark. She kept going. She kept constructing. She kept building the thing she had promised to build that morning at Hatfield under the oak tree, when she said the kingdom of England was her husband and meant it. Kept building until there was no more building to be done, until the cushions on the floor, until the hands unable to hold a pen, until the slow circle above her head, until the quiet in the early hours of a March morning when even the performance finally rested. There is one last chapter to her story that I want to share with you. It is not about events, it is about what remains, about the things she left behind that she did not intend to leave behind, the things that slipped through the careful performance, the windows into the woman who lived inside the Queen, a letter in a box, a poem she mostly did not show, the handwriting on a piece of paper that one person kept and that another person eventually found and that we still have, 400 years later, still have. That is where we're going next, and it will not take long, but I think it might be the most important part of everything. There is something I want to tell you about Westminster Abbey, specifically about a room in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries, opened in 2018 high up in the Triforium of the Abbey, a long gallery of stone and old glass, where they keep the things that do not fit easily into the main narrative, the things that are too fragile, too particular, too quietly extraordinary for the general flow of history. In that gallery in a case there is a ring, small, gold, the inside enamelled with tiny blue flowers. Forget-me-not scholars believe on a gold ground. It is called the Essex ring. The ring Elizabeth allegedly gave to Essex with the promise that if he was ever in trouble and sent it to her, she would forgive him. The ring that, if the story is true, never reached her, that he tried to send and could not, that she never received, and that someone somewhere along the way kept, and that eventually ended up in Westminster Abbey, in a glass case, 420 years after he died. 420 years after she continued playing the virginals when they told her he was gone. It is in a glass case. You can go and look at it. I find that almost unbearably strange. Not the ring itself, the fact that it survived. All the things that were supposed to survive from Elizabeth's reign, the great official records, the state papers, the portraits painted to last, they are there, of course, in archives and galleries and national collections, preserved exactly as intended. But the ring survived by accident, by the specific accident of someone keeping it when they should not have, and then someone else finding it, and then the long chain of small decisions that brings an object across 4 centuries and places it in a glass case where on a particular Tuesday morning in 2024, a woman on a school trip from somewhere in the Midlands leans forward and stares at it, for longer than her teacher expects. The thing that slipped through. This whole story is full of things that slipped through. Things Elizabeth did not intend for anyone to see. The poem about Anjou. She did not publish it. She likely wrote it for herself, and yet it survived. I grieve and dare not show my discontent. I am, and not I freeze and yet am burned, since from myself, another self, I turned. Those lines are in collections now, read by scholars, taught in universities, printed in anthologies, a poem she wrote in private in grief, in the specific moment of turning away from the last man she came closest to choosing, and it has outlasted everything she chose instead. The Armada portrait will outlast it eventually. Stone outlasts paper. But right now, in this century, it is still there, still readable, still honest in the way that private writing is honest when it was never meant to be seen. And then there is the original corset. This is the detail I want you to sit with for a moment. When Elizabeth died in 1603, a wooden funeral effigy was made of her, a full-size figure that was dressed in her actual clothes and carried on her hearse through the streets of London. The effigy was later remade. The clothes were replaced, but the original corset, the one they dressed the effigy in, the one that was beneath the gown, survived. It is in the Abbey Museum now, a small stiffened boned garment, about the size of a human torso, the size of her torso. Exactly. This is what she was shaped like, after all the portraits, after all the elaborate gowns layered over layered over layered. This is the actual shape of the body underneath, small, human-sized, real. I think about that corset the way I think about the 2 words she wrote on Dudley's last letter, his last. Both of them are windows, brief, clear, completely unintentional. A glimpse of the person beneath the queen, the woman beneath the performance, the body beneath the mythology, small, real, still here. Let me tell you what is on her tomb. The white marble monument in the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey was commissioned by James I in 1606, made by sculptor Maximilian Colt. The effigy shows Elizabeth as she was in old age, not the frozen 41-year-old of the official portrait, her actual old age. The face is lined, the hands are thin, she's wearing a crown and holding the orb and sceptre. She's lying down as if resting, as if she finally allowed herself to rest. The Latin inscriptions on the tomb were composed to record her achievements. Religion restored to its primitive purity. Peace settled. The Spanish Armada vanquished. Ireland stabilized. England enriched. All the official achievements, all the things a king's 2 bodies was supposed to accomplish. And underneath the monument in the vault below the floor, Elizabeth lies on top of Mary, the Protestant queen on top of the Catholic queen, the 2 of them together in the dark in the cold stone silence beneath the marble floor. Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep. Elizabeth and Mary sisters in the hope of the resurrection. Mary wanted to be buried with her mother Catherine of Aragon at Peterborough. That wish was ignored. Elizabeth wanted to be remembered as a virgin who had reigned and died for her people. That wish was fulfilled so completely that it has outlasted everything else. And yet, in the vault, in the actual physical dark beneath the stone, there are 2 sisters sharing a space as they shared a world, as they shared a father who remade everything around them and left them both carrying the wreckage of it. 2 daughters of Henry VIII, each one of them the most important woman in England in her time, each one of them alone in the way that the most surrounded people are sometimes alone, together in the end. I want to say something now that has nothing to do with history, something that is just mine. When I first started spending time with Elizabeth's story, really spending time with it, reading the primary sources and the historians and the letters and the poems, I thought I was going to find a story about power, about a woman who seized power and wielded it, and that was the interesting thing about her. What I actually found was different. I found a woman who understood from the very beginning of her conscious life that the world was not going to make space for her, that the circumstances she was born into were not designed for someone like her, that the world had prepared a particular kind of role, daughter, wife symbol, instrument, and that she was going to have to do something very unusual and very costly to step outside it. And she did it. Not perfectly, not without inflicting harm along the way, not without paying a personal price that I think we are still 4 centuries later not quite accounting for honestly. But she did it. And what she left behind, the age, the language, the plays, the first trembling reach toward the world, Beyond England's shores, all of that would not exist without her specific, particular, hard-won refusal to be what she was expected to be. Here is what I keep coming back to in the end. The girl, the baby at Greenwich Palace, September the 7th, 1533, the document prepared to announce a prince, the single letter added in haste, the princess who was not supposed to matter. I keep coming back to her, because everything else, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Armada, the Golden Age, the tomb in Westminster Abbey, the ring in its glass case, all of it grew from that morning, from that one specific human being, inconvenient, illegitimate, unexpected, unplanned, arriving into a world that had prepared a different story and had to scramble to accommodate the story she was actually going to tell. If there is a lesson in Elizabeth's life, I do not think it is a simple one. It is not be strong. It is not believe in yourself. It is not you can do anything you set your mind to. Those are fine things to say. They are not quite what her life says. What her life says is something harder and stranger and more specific. It says the world's expectations of you are not the truth of you. It says survival is not the same as living, but it can become the beginning of living if you let it. It says the things you carry in silence, the grief, the love you could not have, the decisions you live with in the dark are not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They are the evidence that you were paying attention, that you felt things, that you were real under all the performance, real enough for it to cost you something, real enough to grieve, real enough to keep a letter in a box beside your bed for 15 years and know exactly what it meant. Elizabeth kept that letter. She wrote 2 words on it. She kept it. All those years, all those decisions, all that weight, the letter was still there, his last. She was born a girl in a world that wanted a boy. She became a queen in a world that wanted a king. She reigned for 45 years. She built an age. She held a country together through sheer force of will and attention, and the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. She died alone in the early hours of a March morning, surrounded by people who could not reach her, and she left behind a language shaped by the writers her reign made possible. She left behind a ring in a glass case, a corset in a museum, a poem she mostly did not show, 2 words in her own handwriting, and a name, the Elizabethan age, hers. You know, when I sit with Elizabeth's story for this long, I always end up thinking the same thing. I think about how many women throughout history have carried weight like hers without anyone naming an age after them, without anyone building white marble monuments, without anyone keeping their letters in glass cases. Women who built things and held things together and paid costs nobody accounted for in rooms. Nobody was watching in the quiet hours that did not make it into the record. Elizabeth survived partly because she was a queen, because she had resources and platform and the specific protection that comes from being someone the world has reasons to watch. But the thing inside her, the refusal to be defined by other people's expectations, the intelligence that turned survival into purpose, the quiet insistence on remaining real beneath every layer of performance, that thing is not specific to queens. It is specific to people, to the particular kind of person who looks at what they have been given and decides to make something of it, regardless, quietly, over a long time, with no guarantee that anyone will notice. It is late now. Wherever you are, whatever room, whatever city, whatever corner of the world where these old stories land, I hope tonight you can lie down and feel just a little the specific comfort that comes from knowing you are in a long line of human beings who carried difficult things and kept going anyway, who were real underneath whatever they had to perform, who kept their private letters, who wrote the poems they did not show, who made something out of the materials they were given, even the inconvenient ones, even the ones nobody prepared a document for. Thank you for spending this time with Elizabeth and with me. I mean that genuinely. Stories like this one need people who are willing to sit still and listen, people who find that the older and quieter and more complicated the history is, the more it has to say. You are those people, and I am grateful you are here. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself still thinking about her in the morning, still turning something over, still wanting to know more, I would love to know which part stayed with you. Leave it in the comments. Tell me what you are still thinking about, because I read them. Everyone. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories about people who should not have mattered and turned out to matter enormously. People who survived things that were designed to break them. People who left behind in the things that slipped through the cracks of official history the most honest record of what it actually cost to be alive in the times they lived in. Those stories are coming, and I hope you will be here for them. For now, let the night be quiet. Let Elizabeth rest. She earned it.